What if everything you were taught about the dawn of civilization was wrong? A buried stone complex in southeastern Turkey, deliberately hidden around 8000 BCE, now forces a complete rethinking of human prehistory. By watching to the end, you will discover how this single site overturns the long-held assumption that farming came first, and that only settled societies could build monumental structures, revealing a mystery that challenges the very story of our origins. Who built it? Why was it buried? And what does it tell us about the capabilities of people who lived before cities, before writing, and before agriculture? What comes to mind when you think of the first great builders of human history? In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt took a walk that would rewrite prehistory. He was not digging for a lost civilization. He was surveying a dusty hilltop in southeastern Turkey known as Göbekli Tepe, a place local farmers had long dismissed as nothing more than a nuisance. But Schmidt noticed something on the surface that stopped him cold. The ground was littered with thousands of pieces of flint, the sharp cutting tools left behind by ancient hands. And more strikingly, massive rectangular limestone slabs peeked out from the soil, their edges suggesting they had been deliberately shaped by human effort. For most people, these would have looked like nothing more than scattered rocks. For Schmidt, they were a glaring clue. He recognized the flint tools as Neolithic, dating to a time when humans were supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers living in small mobile bands. Those slabs hinted at something far heavier and more complex than a temporary camp. When he began the first serious excavations the following year, Schmidt did not expect a temple. He expected a burial ground or perhaps a small settlement. But what his team uncovered as they peeled back the layers of sediment and dust was something no one had ever seen before. Beneath the soil lay a series of circular enclosures, each one ringed by massive T-shaped limestone pillars. Some of these monoliths stood nearly 18 feet tall and weighed as much as 20 tons. Carved into their faces were intricate reliefs of foxes, snakes, boars, cranes, and scorpions, a menagerie of animals that seemed to stare out from a forgotten world. The sheer scale of the construction was breathtaking, but the real shock came from the date. Radiocarbon analysis of organic material found alongside the pillars placed the earliest layers at around 9600 BCE. That is more than 11,000 years ago. To put that in perspective, it predates Stonehenge by over 6,000 years. It predates the invention of writing by nearly 7,000 years. It even predates the domestication of wheat and the rise of the first farming villages. Göbekli Tepe was built in a world of hunter-gatherers, people who were assumed to wander the landscape in search of food and had no permanent homes, no complex social hierarchies, and certainly no capacity to coordinate the quarrying, transport, and erection of multi-ton stone monoliths. And yet, here was the evidence buried right beneath their feet. What stunned Schmidt and his team even more was that the site showed no signs of permanent habitation. There were no kitchens, no hearths for daily cooking, no trash piles filled with domestic waste, and no sleeping quarters. The people who built Göbekli Tepe did not live there. They came to this hilltop for a purpose that was not about survival. The structures were not houses, they were not defensive walls, they were not granaries. They were enclosures deliberately roofed, ornamented, and designed for gatherings. Schmidt concluded that he had found the world's first temple, a ritual complex built by people who did not yet know how to farm. It was a staggering reversal of the standard narrative. For over a century, archaeologists had believed that monumental architecture was a luxury that only settled agricultural societies could afford. You needed a food surplus to feed the laborers. You needed a centralized authority to organize the work. You needed a sedentary population to supply the workforce. Gobekli Tepe turned all of that upside down. It suggested that the urge to gather for worship or ceremony may have come first, and that the need to settle down and farm might have been a consequence of that new social impulse, not the cause of it. With each passing excavation season, the mystery only deepened. The scale of the effort required to build Göbekli Tepe was staggering. The nearest source of the hard limestone used for the pillars was at least half a mile away. Each monolith had to be quarried, shaped with flint tools, dragged across rough terrain, and then lifted into place. This would have demanded hundreds of workers, skilled craftsmen, overseers, and a shared vision that could sustain a project over generations. Hunter-gatherer bands were typically small, often numbering no more than a few dozen individuals. They did not leave behind this kind of footprint, so the question arose almost immediately: who were these builders, and what drove them to create something so enduring? As the excavation trenches widened, a second discovery came to light, one that hinted at a deeper, more puzzling story. For more on what lies buried beneath the stone and the true scope of Göbekli Tepe, let the rest of the narrative pull you deeper. Among the first structures to emerge from the soil was what researchers now call Enclosure A. Even after thousands of years buried under sediment, its layout stunned the excavation team. The design was not simple at all. The enclosure formed a perfect circle, roughly 30 feet across, defined by a series of massive T-shaped limestone pillars embedded directly into the bedrock. These were not rough boulders piled haphazardly. Each pillar had been carefully shaped, smoothed, and set upright in a stone socket carved into the ground. The T-shape itself was deliberate. Scholars believe it represents the human form from a stylized perspective, with the wide top serving as a head and the long vertical shaft as a body. Some pillars even feature carved arms and hands wrapped across the front of the stone, as if the figures are holding themselves in a gesture of stillness or reverence. Inside the circle, two larger central pillars stood face to face, towering over the rest. They measured nearly 16 feet tall and weighed as much as 10 tons each. That is about the weight of a fully grown African elephant. To move them from the quarry, ancient workers would have had to cut the stone from a solid limestone outcrop using only flint tools, thin chisels that chipped away at the rock bit by bit. Then they had to drag the massive block across nearly half a mile of uneven terrain, likely using wooden sledges, ropes made from plant fibers, and coordinated manpower. The logistics alone would have required dozens of strong people pulling together under the direction of someone overseeing the entire operation. Getting the pillar to the site was only half the challenge. Once the workers arrived at Enclosure A, they had to lift the monolith upright and drop its base into a prepared stone socket with remarkable precision. An error of just a few inches could cause the pillar to tilt or crack under its own weight. To perform this feat, they probably built earthen ramps or used a system of levers and counterweights. Both methods demand careful planning, trial and error, and a shared understanding of physics that, on paper, hunter-gatherers were not supposed to possess. Yet the results are undeniable. The pillars of enclosure stand exactly where they were placed over 11,000 years ago. Their arrangement in concentric rings suggests that the builders expanded the structure over time, adding new layers as the site's importance grew. Some of the outer stones are smaller and less elaborately carved, possibly the work of a later generation who continued the tradition but lacked the same refined skill. The sophistication of enclosure forces a question that unsettles the comfortable timeline of human development. How did a society without metal tools, without domesticated animals to carry heavy loads, and without a written system to record plans manage to create something so precise and permanent? The answer seems to point toward cooperation on a scale that no one had previously imagined for that era. These were not just families gathering for a seasonal feast. These were networks of groups, possibly from dozens of miles around, who traveled to this hilltop for a shared purpose powerful enough to hold them together across years and decades. And when they arrived, they walked into a space that was not just functional. It was deliberately designed to inspire awe. The low stone benches lining the interior walls suggest that people sat together here, gathered inside the circular enclosure, surrounded by the tall pillars. The carvings on the stone animate the space. Foxes and snakes slither across the surfaces. A wild boar bares its tusks. A crane stretches its neck in mid-step. These animals were not domestic creatures. They were the dangerous and mysterious inhabitants of the world outside the circle. The enclosure itself may have served as a boundary between the chaos of the wild and the order of a gathered community, a place where the unknown was tamed through ceremony and symbol. For researchers, Enclosure became the first clear clue that Göbekli Tepe was not an accident or an outlier. It was the work of a people who had already developed complex ideas about life, death, and the forces of nature. And they expressed those ideas not in words but in stone. But the true surprise came when archaeologists dug deeper into Enclosure and found evidence that the structure had been intentionally buried. Not by time, not by wind and rain, but by human hands, and that discovery raised an even deeper mystery about the fate of the people who built it. At first glance, those T-shaped pillars look like abstract architectural supports, simple geometric slabs arranged to hold up a roof. But as Klaus Schmidt and his team cleaned the ancient dust from their surfaces, they realized these monoliths were far more than building materials. They were bodies. In the dim light of the excavation trench, carved arms began to emerge from the stone, curving gently around the front of the pillars as if the figures were folded in contemplation. Hands appeared at the belly, fingers delicately outlined, reaching toward what might have been a belt or a loincloth. The T shape at the top, they came to understand, was not a crossbeam. It was a head. The builders of Göbekli Tepe had transformed raw limestone into stylized human forms, rows of silent figures standing together in circles meant for gathering. It was a discovery that shifted the entire meaning of the site. These were not columns. They were ancestors, guardians, or deities, and they had been standing there for more than 11,000 years, waiting for someone to notice their arms. Some of the pillars are carved with such care that you can trace the individual fingers folded across the abdomen. Others show a belt or a draped cloth at the waist, suggesting a deliberate cultural costume rather than simple nudity. A few figures even wear what looks like a fox skin or an animal pelt, a detail that hints at ritual dress or status markers within this early society. The decision to depict human features on these massive stones was not accidental. It was a message in a language we no longer speak. Every detail was chosen to convey meaning. The posture is not aggressive. There are no raised weapons, no warlike stances, no scenes of conflict. Instead, these figures stand with their hands in a gesture of calm repose. They seem to be presiding, witnessing, or perhaps receiving. They face inward toward the center of the enclosure, toward the gathered community, as if the entire circle was designed for an encounter between the living and the monumental presence of those who came before. Why go through such extraordinary effort to shape 20-ton slabs into human forms? The answer lies in the way the figures relate to the spaces they define. The pillars do not simply stand in the circle, they frame it. They create a boundary between the inside and the outside. Inside the ring, a community could gather in the shadow of these stone bodies. Outside, the wild world of predators and uncertainty continued. The pillars acted as a kind of permanent congregation, a crowd of still presences that anchored the social world of the builders in stone. This was not architecture as shelter. It was architecture as collective memory, as mythology made visible and tangible. What makes this discovery even more striking is its sheer age. 11,000 years ago, no one else in the world was carving anthropomorphic figures at this scale. There are no comparable monuments anywhere from that era. The sophistication of these carvings implies a developed symbolic system, a shared visual language that every visitor understood. You did not need to be able to read. You only needed to recognize the pose, the gesture, the animal imagery woven into the stone. The hands folded over the belly appear to be in a restful, watchful stance, perhaps inviting reverence. Some archaeologists have compared the posture to depictions of deities in later civilizations, though any direct connection remains speculative, but the implication is clear. These people were not simply surviving, they were thinking in metaphors, they were imagining beings larger than themselves and finding a way to give them a permanent home. The arms carved into the pillars are not just artistic flourishes, they are evidence of a mind that could abstract the human form into a sacred symbol, a mind capable of planning a space that would outlast any single generation. And that raises a haunting question. If these figures are truly stylized representations of humans, then whose likeness do they carry? Were they individual leaders or storytellers from a real community? Or were they purely imagined beings, ancestors of a kind that never walked the earth but lived powerfully in the imagination of an entire people? We may never know the names of the figures who stand in the stone circles of Göbekli Tepe, but their silent presence tells us that the human urge to create meaning through symbols is far older than the first cities, older than writing, older than even the cultivation of wheat. Just beyond Enclosure A, a second circle waited beneath the rubble. As the team carefully cleared away the soil and broken stone, Enclosure B revealed itself, similar in size and shape to the first but with a character all its own. Its circular wall of pillars rose in a ring around a central pair of monoliths, and it was here that the excavation uncovered one of the most striking individual carvings on the entire hill. On the inward face of one of the central pillars, a large fox had been rendered in sharp, fluid detail. The creature was not just sketched or scratched into the stone. It was carved with intention, its body elongated, its tail sweeping downward and its snout stretched forward with a fierce intensity. The eyes of the animal were present. The ears were upright. It was a fox captured in motion, and it sat directly in the sightline of anyone who entered the enclosure. Standing inside the circle, you would have faced this animal carved into stone at eye level, as if it were waiting for you. The fox was not alone on the pillar. Around it, the limestone surface held a swirling composition of other animals, serpents twisting up the side of the monolith, a boar charging across the lower register, and the long legs of cranes wading among the forms. But the fox held the position of highest prominence, dominating the central space and staring inward toward the heart of the enclosure. It was clearly the focal point of the structure, the figure that drew the eye and commanded attention. For the team excavating Enclosure B, the choice of the fox as a central motif raised immediate questions. The fox in this landscape was not a domesticated animal. It was not a source of food or materials. It was a wild predator known for its cunning and its elusiveness, a creature of the margins between the human world and the wilderness. Why would the builders elevate this particular animal to the central position in a ritual space? And why repeat its image across multiple pillars, in multiple enclosures, across the entire site? The answer that has emerged over years of study suggests something deeper than mere decoration. These animal carvings appear to have functioned as totemic symbols. A totem is not just a picture of an animal. It is a representation of identity, of belonging to a group or a lineage. For the builders of Göbekli Tepe, different groups traveling to the site from miles around may have carried their own totemic animal, a symbol that anchored their family, their clan, or their spiritual tradition. The fox might have belonged to a specific group of people, their emblem carved into the stone that would stand for thousands of years as a marker of their presence. When visitors entered Enclosure B and stood before the fox, they were entering the domain of the people who claimed that animal as their guardian or ancestor. The fox carvings are far from the only totemic suggestion at the site. Elsewhere, snakes coil around pillars, boars charge across the stone, cranes stretch their necks skyward, and spiders creep along the margins. Each enclosure seems to emphasize a different set of animals. Some researchers have proposed that each circle represents a separate clan or tribal group, a distinct community that came together at this central location to participate in gatherings that united the entire region. The presence of these totemic carvings scattered across dozens of pillars tells us something profound about the people who built this place. They were not a single, homogeneous group. They were a network of separate bands with distinct identities and local traditions, yet they found a way to gather at a common site in a shared ceremonial space, and their animal symbols coexisted on the same stone pillars. They did not erase each other's emblems. They arranged them together in a structured, deliberate manner that suggests tolerance, collaboration, and a mutual respect for the differences between groups. That level of social coordination so early in human history is nothing short of astonishing. It implies that these hunter-gatherer bands had developed diplomatic relationships, shared ritual calendars, and a trust that allowed them to work side by side on a massive building project. They did not need a king or a written code of laws to coordinate. They needed a shared belief system, a set of stories and symbols that made sense to everyone, regardless of where they came from. And that belief system is preserved on the stones of Enclosure B. The fox, the snake, the boar, the crane, each one a piece of a larger puzzle that we are only beginning to understand. As the digging continued, the true scope of the social world behind these symbols started to emerge, revealing that the influence of this hilltop temple stretched far beyond the immediate landscape. Out beyond the fox and the snakes of Enclosure B, a larger circle waited to tell its own story. Enclosure C was the biggest of the early structures, its diameter stretching nearly 50 feet across. As the excavation opened this massive space, it revealed a central pair of pillars that towered above all the others. Each one stood nearly 18 feet high and carried an intricate gallery of carvings that seemed to represent a complete symbolic universe. On the left-facing pillar, a wild aurochs filled the upper register, its powerful body etched with long, graceful horns. This was no ordinary hunting scene. The aurochs stood on a pedestal, elevated and commanding, with a dignity that suggested reverence rather than conquest. The chest of the animal was carved with geometric lines and flowing shapes, as if the surface of its body was being used as a canvas for an entire visual language. By contrast, the right-facing pillar offered a vertical procession. Snakes coiled upward along the shaft, their scales rendered with precise, repeated strokes that must have taken hours of painstaking work with nothing more than a flint bearing. Just above the snakes, a crane stretched its neck to the top of the pillar. Its beak opened as if uttering a silent call that echoed down through 11,000 years. Each bird, each snake, each beast was placed with careful regard for the composition as a whole. The images on one pillar balanced the images on the other. This was not a random collection of animal forms scratched into the stone. It was a unified symbolic program, a deliberate sequence of meaning that would have unfolded as a visitor moved through the space. Consider what it took to plan this arrangement. The people who built Enclosure C had no paper, no sketches, no written references to consult. The design existed entirely in their minds and in the shared memory of their community. They chose a team of skilled carvers, sent them into a quarry half a mile away, and guided them in transforming raw limestone into a pair of monuments that mirrored one another in theme and execution. Every ridge carved into the stone had to be planned before the first chip was removed. There was no room for error in a 20-ton slab. One deep mistake and the whole surface would be ruined. The final result is a masterpiece of composition that would be impressive today in any gallery. Enclosure C represented the peak of what the builders of Göbekli Tepe achieved. It showed that these ancient people had developed a sophisticated artistic tradition, one that could organize complex visual narratives across multiple panels. They understood proportion, symmetry, and the relationship between images and the space around them. They understood how to guide the eye of someone standing on the stone floor, watching the carvings emerge in the firelight. One animal stands out more than any other in the carvings at Göbekli Tepe. Not the fox, not the snake, not the boar. It is the vulture, in the most elaborate of all the enclosures yet discovered, designated Enclosure D. A single pillar carries a scene that has haunted archaeologists since the moment it was uncovered. On the face of this monolith, a vulture is carved in sharp detail. Its wings are spread wide, its talons are extended, and its hooked beak is poised as if descending. Below the vulture, a scorpion curls its tail, and beside it, a headless human figure lies on the ground. The figure has no head, the neck is clean, and the body is still. This is not a hunting scene, it is not a battle scene, it is something far older and far stranger. For years, researchers have studied this image, trying to understand what kind of event or belief it represents. The presence of the vulture, a scavenger that consumes flesh after death, together with the headless human form, has led to a powerful theory. This might be the earliest known depiction of a sky burial, a funerary practice in which the deceased is placed in the open, not buried or burned, but offered back to nature through the agency of scavenging birds. In cultures across Central Asia, Tibet, and parts of the Americas, this tradition was seen as an act of generosity and spiritual release. The body returned to the elements, the soul freed to travel upward with the birds. The carvers of the Vulture Stone may have captured a ritual exactly like that. The scene would have been a familiar one to the people who gathered in Enclosure D. Death was not hidden away in a grave, unknown and distant. It was witnessed, it was part of the cycle of the land, and the vulture, rather than being feared as a creature of decay, might have been honored as a being that helped the spirit complete its journey. The headless figure on the stone suggests that the head was treated separately, and indeed, excavations across the site have uncovered a peculiar pattern of human remains that supports this interpretation. Although no formal cemetery has been found at Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists have discovered fragments of human bone scattered across the surface of the buried structures. Skull fragments especially appear in unusual contexts. Pieces of human crania have been found near the central pillars, as if they were deliberately placed. Some skulls even show signs of having been cut apart and reworked, possibly into ceremonial objects or containers for offerings. One skull fragment bears a deliberately carved groove, like the kind you would make to hang an object as a memento. The evidence points toward a culture that did not simply dispose of their dead. They maintained a connection with them. Skulls, in particular, seem to have carried great significance. They may have been displayed, passed down through generations, or used in rituals performed within the very circles of the standing pillars. If so, then Enclosure D was not just a place for gathering. It was a theater of the afterlife. The carvings on the pillars, the handling of bones, the orientation of the structures, all of it seems to have been organized around how the living related to those who had passed. And the Vulture Stone is the central emblem of that relationship. The animal imagery was not random. In the symbolic language of Göbekli Tepe, the vulture represented transformation. It consumed the flesh and carried the spirit away. The scorpion reminded viewers of the sting of death itself. The headless figure showed what was left behind after the spirit departed. Together, they formed a statement about the fate that awaited everyone, and that statement was carved into stone that would outlast the bones of everyone who saw it. When a person stepped into Enclosure D, they were walking into a space where life, death, and the journey between were pressed into permanent shape. The stones did not ask for words. They simply showed what must happen, and in that showing they gave a form to grief, to hope, and to mystery itself. The skulls found near these pillars suggest that, in some cases, the process was brought directly into the enclosure. Perhaps the bodies of the honored dead were first exposed to the elements outside the circle, letting the vultures do their ancient work before the skull was retrieved, cleaned, and brought inside to join the community of the standing ancestors. For the people who followed this tradition, there was no end, there was only transformation. The same land that fed their children and gave them stone to carve also took back their bodies, and it did so through wings that descended from the sky. The Vulture Stone preserves that relationship in stark, unforgettable detail. It is a window into a belief system that is completely alien to us, yet deeply human in its desire to find meaning in the face of loss. That scene on the stone, frozen for 11,000 years, reveals that the people of Göbekli Tepe carried a profound awareness of the cycle of existence. They did not hide from death, they carved it into the center of their world, and when the time came to leave the site forever, they did something so deliberate, so costly, and so revealing that it continues to challenge every idea we have about who these people really were. Some pillars at Göbekli Tepe carried images that did not whisper, they snarled. Among the most startling of all the carvings is the boar, captured in stone with its bristles raised, its mouth open, and its long curved tusks exposed like a challenge. The boar on these monoliths is not a passive creature waiting to be admired. It is rendered mid-charge, its weight thrust forward, its legs braced for impact. Every detail of the carving emphasizes danger. The tusks are emphasized and lengthened beyond the natural proportion. The jaw is locked in a grimace. The eye is a sharp carved dot that seems to follow you across the enclosure. Standing before such an image in the firelit interior of the circle, you would have felt the same jolt of alertness that comes from stumbling across a real boar in the wild. The builders went out of their way to preserve that feeling in stone, and they placed these aggressive figures not at the edges of the site, but on the central pillars, directly in the path of anyone moving through the sacred space. Why would a community that gathered here for ceremony and connection carve warnings into the heart of their temple? The answer may lie in how these people understood power. A wild boar was one of the most dangerous animals in the prehistoric landscape. It was fast, unpredictable, armed with teeth that could gut a dog in seconds, and protected by a thick hide that was nearly impossible to pierce with flint-tipped spears. Hunters who went after a boar knew they were taking a serious risk. A single mistake and the hunted became the hunter. In carving the boar with such deliberate ferocity, the builders were not simply recording an animal they saw in their daily life. They were summoning its raw power and harnessing it as a guardian for the enclosure. The boar on the pillar says in a language older than words, "You are entering a space that is not ordinary." Here, the rules of the outside world do not apply. The danger carved into the stone becomes a threshold that you cross at your own responsibility. It defines the enclosure as a place apart, a zone where the everyday safety of the camp or the home is replaced by something much older and more intense. And the boar is not alone in this role. Across the other enclosures, snakes coil in positions that suggest readiness to strike. Spiders spread their legs across the pillars. Scorpions curl their tails upward in the eternal threat pose. Even the foxes, which we see in quieter postures on some stones, can appear elsewhere with teeth bared and ears flattened. The entire collection of animals at Göbekli Tepe forms a catalogue of the dangers that surrounded the human world. Together, they build a symbolic landscape that reinforced a central message. This site was powerful. It was not safe in the way a village or a camp is safe. It was charged. Entering it meant coming face to face with forces that could not be tamed. And that message, carved into the hardest available material, would have resonated deeply with every visitor. They knew from direct experience how deadly a boar could be, how quick a snake could strike, how final the sting of a scorpion could feel. The stones took that knowledge and elevated it into a spiritual vocabulary. The boar became not just an animal, but a symbol of the untamed power that stood at the edge of human control. By carving it and placing it at the center of their ritual world, the people of Göbekli Tepe acknowledged that the wild was not something to be conquered and eliminated. It was something to be respected, invoked, and perhaps even befriended on certain terms. The boar warned away the unprepared while anchoring the initiated more deeply to the ceremony taking place within the circle. Its presence marks the enclosure as a point of contact with forces that existed long before the arrival of the first gatherers at this hill, and those forces did not end with the animals on the pillars. As excavations continued across the broader landscape, researchers began to realize that the stone guardians of the enclosures were not the only powers the builders learned to reckon with. Across the rolling hills near the site, the quarry pits are still visible, gashes in the earth where massive slabs of limestone were pried loose over 11,000 years ago. Each pillar started its life here, embedded in the living rock. To extract it, the builders had to cut a channel around the desired block using only flint tools, thin blades that could chip away at the limestone hour after hour. They did not have iron chisels or steel wedges. They had patience, sharp stone, and a clear understanding of the fracture lines that run through the limestone. By scoring deep grooves and then hammering wooden wedges into the cracks, they could split a pillar away from the bedrock with surprising precision. The surfaces of the abandoned blocks in the quarry still bear the marks of those ancient tools, scratches and grooves that map out the exact sequence of cuts the workers followed. It is evidence of a well-understood engineering process. They knew where to strike, at what angle, and in what order to free a 20-ton block without shattering it. That knowledge alone suggests a specialization of labor that should not have existed in a hunter-gatherer society. There would have been master stone cutters, apprentices, and experienced overseers who passed down their techniques across generations. Once the block was free, the real challenge began. The nearest finished pillars at the enclosures are roughly 500 meters away from the quarry. That is about 5 football fields of uneven, sloping, rocky ground. To move the multi-ton block across that distance, the builders almost certainly relied on wooden sledges, simple platforms made from tree trunks that could slide over a prepared track. But a sledge bearing 20 tons of stone does not slide easily. Friction would have locked it in place without some form of lubrication. Experiments by modern archaeologists have shown that wetting the ground ahead of the sledge can reduce friction significantly, allowing a large team of pullers to make steady progress. Even so, the workforce needed would have been enormous. Pulling a 5-ton block on a sledge requires about 50 people. For the largest central pillars at up to 20 tons, you would need at least 200 strong individuals pulling in coordinated effort, plus additional workers to clear the path, lay logs or greased planks ahead of the sledge, and replace worn ropes. The ropes themselves had to be made from plant fibers, likely twisted from local reeds or woody vines, braided into thick cables that could bear immense tension without snapping. The ropes would have needed constant maintenance, rebraiding, and replacement as they frayed under the load. Moving a single pillar from quarry to enclosure was not a days-long operation. It was a weeks-long logistical project that required a dedicated team working together under skilled direction. That means the builders were already organized into a hierarchy of roles. Some directed the effort, others pulled, others maintained tools, others scouted and prepared the route, others supported the workforce with food, water, and rest. This level of coordination suggests a social structure that could assign tasks, manage resources, and keep hundreds of people working toward a common goal. For decades, textbooks taught that such structures only emerged after agriculture allowed populations to settle and develop hierarchies. But the quarries of Göbekli Tepe challenge that claim directly. The stone speaks of organization that predated the first farms, and the puzzle deepens further when you consider the wheels. There are none. The builders of Göbekli Tepe did not know the wheel, or if they did not use it for transport. There are no draft animals to pull the sledges. The horse had not yet been domesticated. The ox was still a wild aurochs roaming the valleys. Every inch of that 500-meter journey was accomplished by human muscle alone. The route had to be cleared of boulders, branches, and steep drop-offs before the first pull began. If the ground was wet or muddy, the sledge could sink and lock in place. If the weather turned, the entire operation might grind to a halt for days or weeks. The seasons would have dictated the work. Winter rains would have made the ground soft and treacherous. Summer heat would have exhausted the pulling crews faster. The most efficient window for moving heavy stone would have been the dry autumn months after the harvest season, when the ground was firm but the temperatures were bearable. And that points to yet another dimension of planning. The builders did not quarry and move stone year-round. They had to schedule the work around the seasonal cycle of wild food availability. When the migrating herds passed through the region, the workforce would have scattered to hunt, gather, and store provisions for the winter. The pillar-moving operation would pause and resume later. It suggests a seasonal labor force, a mobile population that came together at the hill for the ritual season, and then dispersed across the landscape to live the rest of the year as traditional hunter-gatherers. This model turns the conventional story on its head. People did not settle down to build monuments. They built monuments, and then, perhaps, the demands of that work began the slow process of settling down. The quarry site also holds evidence of planning at the scale of centuries. The pillars were not all extracted at once. Different quarry zones show signs of use at different times, sometimes with long gaps between. Generations returned to the same stone outcrops, knowing exactly where to cut to find the best quality limestone. The knowledge of where to quarry was passed down across lifetimes. It was a living tradition, not a single event. Standing in the quarry trench today, you can see the marks of that tradition etched into the rock. A partly carved pillar still attached to the bedrock, its upper face roughed into shape, its base still clamped to the earth. Someone started carving this monolith and never finished. Perhaps the team moved on to another project. Perhaps the community that commissioned it faded away before the stone could be freed. The silence of that unfinished block speaks louder than words. It tells us that Göbekli Tepe was not the work of a single generation or a single burst of energy. It was the work of a culture that sustained itself across decades and centuries. And yet, despite all that effort, despite the hundreds of thousands of hours of coordinated labor, the site was not abandoned by accident. It was buried intentionally. That choice to fill the circles with rubble and soil is one of the strangest chapters in the story of Göbekli Tepe. When you stand at the edge of the excavation trenches today, you can see the story of Göbekli Tepe written directly in the earth itself, a sequence of layers that tell a very clear tale. The deepest levels, what archaeologists call Layer 3, contain the earliest and most impressive structures. Here, the massive T-shaped pillars, the intricate animal carvings, the carefully engineered circular enclosures all sit at the lowest point of the dig. Radiocarbon dating of organic material from these deepest strata places their construction at around 9,600 BCE. That means these magnificent circles were built, used, and maintained for roughly 1,500 years before the first seeds of agriculture were even planted in the region. Above these oldest layers, something begins to change. As you move upward through the stratigraphy, the architectural style shifts. The stone circles grow smaller. The pillars become less massive, the carvings less elaborate. By the time you reach the upper layers, which researchers call Layer 2, the enclosures have lost much of their former grandeur. The precision of the oldest works, the sense of a unified vision driving the entire effort, seems to fade. The later builders were still engaged in monumental construction, but they were working at a diminished scale. The T-shaped pillars are present, but they are noticeably shorter and less carefully finished. the rings of stone are no longer perfect circles but rough approximations. The rich bestiary of carved animals gives way to simpler, more repetitive designs. The tradition continued, but the energy and ambition of the earliest generations had waned. The chronological story is preserved in the dirt and rubble that filled these structures. Layer by layer, the evidence stacks up. The earliest circles were built with the greatest skill and effort, and over the centuries that followed, each generation seemed to contribute slightly less, their monuments a little less bold, a little less committed. This is not the story of a people who ran out of ideas. It is the story of a tradition that slowly ran out of steam. The ritual purpose of the site survived for thousands of years, but the passion that had driven its creation, the conviction that moved 20-ton stones across half a mile of rocky ground, had diminished. The final page of this stone chronicle is the strangest of all. At the very top of the stratigraphy, Layer 1 contains nothing but backfill. At some point, probably around 8000 BC, the last generation to use Göbekli Tepe made a deliberate and labor-intensive decision. They did not abandon the site to the elements. They systematically filled each enclosure with rubble, stone chips, and the broken debris of their own discarded tools. Ton after ton of fill material was carried in and packed tightly around the standing pillars, burying the monuments completely. The hill was reshaped, smoothed over, and left to the wind and rain. By the time the first farmers settled in the valley below, the great temple of Göbekli Tepe was invisible, sealed beneath a gentle rise in the landscape where it would sleep for 11,000 years. That burial tells a story more haunting than any carving on the stones. The people who walked away from the site chose to preserve it in a very specific way. They did not dismantle the pillars, they did not smash the carvings, they wrapped the whole complex in a coat of earth, as if they were placing a loved one in a grave. They covered something they considered too powerful, too significant, or too dangerous to leave exposed. Perhaps their belief system had shifted. Perhaps the meaning of the site had exhausted itself after so many centuries. Or perhaps, as some researchers suggest, the great gathering that had brought thousands of people to this hill for over 2,000 years had simply come to a natural close. The climate was changing, the herds were moving, the social networks that had sustained the ritual cycle were dissolving. And in that moment, the final generation made a choice that preserved the site not as a ruin but as a time capsule. They tucked it into the earth, cleaned the space around it, and walked away into a new era. The stratigraphy of Göbekli Tepe is more than just dirt and stone. It is a chronicle of human belief, ambition, and the slow shifting of priorities across 2,500 years. The earliest builders aimed for the sky. Their descendants built closer to the ground, and the last caretakers put the whole thing to rest, leaving a question buried in the soil that we are only beginning to unearth. That same soil now hides a detail that changes the entire relationship between this hilltop temple and the first farmers, a detail found not inside the enclosures, but far away in the ancient grains that fed the people who built them. The backfill that sealed Göbekli Tepe was not a gentle accumulation of wind-blown dust. It was a deliberate and massive act of closure. Archaeologists studying the composition of the fill inside the enclosures found that it contained thousands of animal bones, broken stone tools, and fragments of debris that had been collected from the surrounding midden heaps and carried into the circles. This was not dirt that had naturally drifted over the centuries. It was material that people had gathered, hauled, and dumped by hand, packing it tightly around the standing pillars until the entire complex was smothered under a layer of rubble and soil. The sheer labor involved in that burial is staggering. It took almost as much effort to fill the site as it did to build it in the first place, and the fill itself contains clues that point toward a final ritual that played out across the entire hilltop. The animal bones found in the backfill are dominated by the remains of gazelle and wild cattle, the same species that were carved onto the pillars. but there is a striking pattern to the distribution of these remains. They are not scattered randomly, they are concentrated in specific zones around the central pillars, as if feasting and ceremony took place during the filling process itself. The final generation may have held a prolonged gathering, a last great festival to honor the site before covering it forever. The tools in the field tell another story. They are overwhelmingly made of flint, and many show signs of heavy wear, as if they were used one final time for the backfilling work before being discarded in the same pits they helped to create. It is as if the workers symbolically surrendered their implements to the site, leaving their mark on the very material that would hide the monuments. That choice of burying the tools alongside the enclosures suggests an act of closure that was meant to be permanent, a deliberate ending with no intention of return. The question that haunts every researcher is why? Why would a people who had invested thousands of years of tradition and effort into this site decide to erase it from the visible world? Several theories have emerged, each offering a different perspective on the minds of those final builders. One possibility is that the burial was a ritual act of decommissioning. Many sacred structures in human history have not simply been abandoned. They have been formally closed, sometimes with elaborate ceremonies that acknowledge the end of their sacred function. When a temple in ancient Mesopotamia was no longer used, its foundation was often cleaned, covered, and sealed with an inscribed tablet before a new one was built on top. The builders of Göbekli Tepe may have been acting on a similar impulse. By covering the enclosures, they were respectfully retiring the space, sending it into the earth with the same care that had accompanied its construction. Another theory points toward a protective motive. Perhaps the rising pressures of a changing world made the site vulnerable. As the regional climate began to shift toward drier conditions around 8000 BCE, wild game herds may have dwindled, and the seasonal gatherings that had drawn thousands of people to the hilltop may have become less sustainable. At the same time, the first experiments with agriculture were beginning in the nearby valleys, creating new kinds of social tensions between mobile hunter-gatherer traditions and the emerging settled way of life. In that context, burying the site could have been a preemptive measure, an act of safekeeping designed to preserve the sacred enclosures from desecration or neglect. A third theory suggests a response to environmental stress. There is growing evidence that the region experienced a significant climatic downturn around the time of the burial, a period of prolonged drought that would have disrupted the ecological rhythms that the builders relied on for food and water. The ritual gatherings that had sustained the site for 2,000 years may have become impossible to maintain when the herds stopped migrating and the seasonal rains failed. In this view, the burial was a final collective decision born out of necessity, not choice. The communities that once gathered at Göbekli Tepe could no longer support the large-scale gatherings that the site demanded. Rather than let the enclosures crumble into ruin under the assault of wind and time, they covered them carefully, as if putting the entire complex to rest while it was still intact and meaningful. None of these theories need be exclusive. The burial of Göbekli Tepe may have been driven by a combination of spiritual, practical, and environmental forces that we can only glimpse through the debris left behind. But one thing is certain: the act was deliberate, coordinated, and deeply symbolic. The last people who stood among the T-shaped pillars did not walk away and leave them to decay. They wrapped the entire hilltop in earth, placed their tools in the grave, and walked away into a world that was changing faster than anything their ancestors had known. That mound of soil and stone remained undisturbed for 11,000 years, protecting the secrets of a civilization that pushed back the dawn of organized society by thousands of years. And when Klaus Schmidt first walked across its surface in 1994, he could not have guessed what lay beneath his feet. The questions raised by that burial have only grown more urgent as excavations continue. If the people who built Göbekli Tepe were willing to bury their greatest achievement, What does that say about the next step in their journey? What kind of world did they step into after sealing away the oldest temple on Earth? The flint tools littered across the surface of Göbekli Tepe told the excavators an immediate and surprising story. Among the thousands of chipped stone blades, scrapers, and points, there was not a single sickle blade. In the ancient world, a sickle is the signature tool of a farmer. It has a distinctive glossy edge caused by repeatedly cutting the silica-rich stems of domesticated grains. Not one of these blades was found. The people who built and used this site were not harvesting wheat or barley. They were hunting and gathering everything they needed from the wild landscape around them. For more than a decade of excavation, the soil has been sifted and screened with meticulous care. Thousands of animal bones have been catalogued, every single one belonging to wild species. There are the bones of gazelle, the primary prey of the region. There are the heavy remains of wild cattle, the aurochs, whose massive horns were carved into the pillars. There are the bones of wild boar, wild sheep, and wild deer. Not a single bone from a domesticated goat or sheep has turned up in the earliest layers. The same story applies to the plant remains. Archaeobotanists have floated and analyzed bucket after bucket of soil from the site, looking for the microscopic remains of seeds and grains. They have found wild almonds, wild pistachios, and the tiny seeds of wild grasses. They have found lentils and peas, but in their wild forms, not the larger, plumper versions that come from domesticated crops. There is no evidence that anyone was planting or tending crops near the enclosures. There are no silos for storage, no grinding stones worn smooth by processing large quantities of grain, no charred remains of bread or porridge in the hearths. The builders of Göbekli Tepe simply did not farm. This absence of domesticated species creates a deep problem for the traditional narrative of human civilization. For decades, the standard model told a very clear sequence. First, people learned to domesticate plants and animals. This gave them a reliable food surplus. That surplus allowed populations to grow and settle in permanent villages. Those villages eventually supported craft specialists, leaders, and organizers. And those organizers, in turn, could command the labor needed to build monumental structures like temples and pyramids. The logic seemed airtight. You cannot have the monument without the surplus. Göbekli Tepe turned that logic on its head. Here was a monumental complex that required hundreds of people working together over generations. Yet the people who built it had no surplus stored in granaries. They had no herds of sheep or goats waiting to be slaughtered for a large workforce. They had no fields of wheat to feed a permanent settlement. They lived by the hunt and the seasonal harvest of wild plants. And somehow they managed to quarry, transport, and erect 20-ton pillars into carefully designed stone circles. The only way this makes sense is if the workforce was not supported by stored food, but by the natural abundance of the region. Southeastern Turkey in the era of Göbekli Tepe was not the arid landscape we see today. It was a lush grassland dotted with oak and pistachio woodlands. Wild herds of gazelle migrated through the valleys in vast numbers. Stands of wild wheat and barley grew thick along the hillsides. The people who came to this hilltop did not need to farm to feed a large gathering. They could hunt the migrating herds and collect the ripening grains in a seasonal harvest that required no cultivation. They feasted on wild bounty during the ritual season, dispersed across the landscape for the rest of the year, and gathered again the following season to continue the work. This model, a seasonally aggregated workforce of hunter-gatherers sustained by wild resources, had no precedent in archaeological theory. It was simply not supposed to be possible. But the evidence beneath the rubble left no room for debate. The bones and the seeds and the absence of domesticated species all pointed to the same conclusion. The first monument builders were not farmers. They were foragers, people who had not yet settled down, people who knew the movements of the herds and the cycles of the wild grains as intimately as later generations would know their fields and flocks. Theirs was a world of mobility, of seasonal rhythms, of knowledge passed down not through books or schools but through stories told around the fire and walks taken across the same hunting grounds year after year. That world did not lack complexity. In fact, it may have demanded a different kind of complexity, one rooted not in controlling the landscape but in reading it deeply. The fact that no domesticated species appear at Göbekli Tepe pushes the timeline for social complexity back by thousands of years. It suggests that the human capacity for large-scale cooperation, for shared ritual, and for monumental expression did not wait for agriculture to unlock it. It was already there, waiting for the right set of conditions to express itself in stone. The traditional model of civilization may still be correct in describing what happened after farming took hold. But it can no longer claim to explain what came before, and what came before, as the stones of Göbekli Tepe prove, was far more sophisticated than anyone had ever imagined. If the builders were not farmers, then what was their relationship with the wild grains and animals that surrounded them? Beneath the earth around the ancient enclosures, microscopic secrets lay buried alongside the bones of gazelle and wild cattle. Researchers sifted through the sediment with fine sieves and floated the soil in water, patiently searching for the tiny remains of ancient plant life. What they found in those dark grains of dirt was something that quietly reshaped the entire understanding of how the builders lived and worked. They discovered the seeds of wild einkorn wheat, a tough ancient grain that still grows in the mountainous regions of Turkey today. But these seeds were not scattered casually across the landscape. They were concentrated in specific zones near the stone circles, and they showed clear evidence of being processed. The einkorn kernels had been crushed, they had been exposed to heat, they had been ground against stone surfaces in a way that suggested purposeful preparation on a scale far beyond a single family meal. The wild wheat was not growing in orderly rows outside the temple. It was being collected from the hillsides, carried to the site, and turned into something edible and storable. The scale of that operation, the sheer volume of grain represented by the remains, hints at an effort that bridged the gap between simple foraging and the organized harvesting that would later define the first farms. To understand what this means, you have to picture the labor involved. Gathering wild einkorn is not as simple as walking through a field and pulling ears of wheat. Wild grain shatters when it is ripe, its seeds falling to the ground at the slightest touch. You have to collect the ears before they fully ripen, bundle them, and bring them to a place where the seeds can be threshed and winnowed without losing half the harvest. A family group could gather enough for their own needs in a few days, but the evidence at Göbekli Tepe suggests far more was being brought in. The volume of crushed seeds and the wear patterns on the grinding stones point to processing that could feed dozens, perhaps hundreds, of people during a single gathering season. That implies a coordinated collection effort, with teams fanning out across the landscape at the exact right moment, when the einkorn was at peak ripeness, and returning with loads of grain bundled in skins or woven baskets. This was not farming. There is no sign that the people were planting seeds, irrigating, or weeding. They were harvesting what grew naturally, but they were doing so on a schedule and a scale that required communication, planning, and shared knowledge of when and where the grain would be ready. Over years and decades, those repeated harvesting cycles would have taught them everything they needed to know about the plant, its growth habits, its preferred soil, its response to weather. They knew the einkorn intimately without ever calling it a crop. This relationship with the wild grain created a kind of surplus that was renewable but not guaranteed. In a good year, when the rains came at the right time and the herds were plentiful, the people could gather a large store of einkorn that allowed them to stay at the hilltop for extended periods, feasting, working on the stone circles, and performing the rituals that bound their communities together. In a lean year, the grain was scarce and the gatherings smaller, but the presence of the enclosures, the shared vision carved into the pillars, acted as a magnet that pulled these groups back season after season, generation after generation. The wild wheat became the fuel that made the monumental work possible. Without it, supporting the massive labor force required to quarry and move the 20-ton pillars would have been nearly impossible. The gathering of the grain, the hunting of the gazelle, and the construction of the temple were all part of the same seasonal cycle, an annual rhythm that moved the people across the landscape and back to the hilltop when the time was right. That cycle lies at the blurred edge between foraging and farming. The people were not yet farmers, but they were practicing a form of landscape management that nudged the line forward. By harvesting the einkorn so intensively, they were selecting for the very traits that would later lead to domestication. The plants whose seeds did not shatter easily were the ones that got collected and processed, leaving more of their genes in the population of wild wheat near the human gathering sites. Over centuries, this unconscious selection could have transformed the plant, slowly making it more dependent on human harvesting for its own reproduction. The wild wheat at the threshold of Göbekli Tepe was a wheat on the verge of becoming a crop. The line between forager and farmer was never a sharp cliff. It was a long, gentle slope that the builders of the temple walked for 2,000 years without ever reaching the bottom. The grinding stones and charred seeds preserved in the soil hold the evidence of that long walk, and they force us to rethink what it meant to be a human society on the brink of a new way of life. What happened when those seasonal rhythms began to shift, and the wild wheat that had sustained the gatherings became less reliable? The wild einkorn grinding to a halt was not the only change that rippled through the landscape around Göbekli Tepe. As the generations turned and the climate slowly shifted, the herds of gazelle that had thundered through the valleys in vast numbers began to thin. The acorn harvests from the oak woodlands became less reliable. The seasonal rhythm that had pulled hundreds of people back to the hilltop each year started to weaken, fraying at the edges like an old rope. Yet even as the material foundation of the gatherings eroded, the symbolic language carved into the stone remained stubbornly fixed, a message preserved in animal forms that spoke of a world far more complex than simple survival. Think of the menagerie etched into those 20-ton monoliths. Foxes slink along the stone faces, snakes coil in undulating bands, boars charge with bristled backs. Aurochs stand in solemn profile, cranes stretch their long necks skyward, scorpions curl their tails in defense, spiders crawl across the limestone with meticulous legs. For years, the initial assumption was that these carvings were merely decorative, a primitive bestiary of whatever creatures the builders saw around them. But as the excavations deepened and the number of carvings grew, a different pattern emerged. These animals were not chosen at random. They were repeated in specific poses, in specific enclosures, in specific combinations. The same animal appears again and again, carved with the same posture, suggesting that each creature carried a fixed meaning. The builders were not just illustrating their world. They were using a symbolic vocabulary, a system of visual signs that held consistent significance across the entire site. Consider how the snake appears in almost every enclosure. It is rarely alone. It is often intertwined with other animals, wrapped around the necks of birds or curling up the shaft of a pillar beside a fox. In some cultures around the world, the snake has long been associated with transition, with the boundary between life and death, with the hidden currents of the underworld. At Göbekli Tepe, its omnipresence suggests a similar role. It may have been a guardian of the threshold, a creature that marked the space between the ordinary world and the sacred realm of the enclosures. The serpent, silent and mysterious, watches from the stone. The fox appears with equal frequency but in a different context. It is almost always depicted on the central pillars, in the most prominent position within the circle. The fox is a trickster in many folk traditions, clever and elusive, a creature that moves between worlds and sees what others cannot. On the stone of Enclosure B, it dominated the central pillar, staring inward at the gathered community. The builders may have placed it there as a symbol of cunning intelligence or spiritual vision, a totem for those who led the ceremonies. Its repeated elevation to the focal point of the circle suggests it was more than just a clan emblem. It was a figure of authority, a guide for the ritual journey that took place within the stone ring. The boar stands in stark contrast. It is never still, never serene. The boar is action, a creature of aggression and raw force. When you stand before a boar carving at Göbekli Tepe, you are facing a barrier, a warning that the path forward requires strength and courage. The boar may have represented the obstacle that the initiate had to overcome, a test of resolve that had to be passed before the deeper mysteries of the enclosure could be accessed. Its tusks are always exaggerated, its posture always lunging, its energy always ready to explode from the stone. A different energy entirely radiates from the crane. Standing on long legs with its beak pointed upward, the crane appears in several enclosures, but most prominently in Enclosure C, where it rises beside the vertical serpent. In many traditions across the ancient world, the crane is a messenger between earth and sky. Its migration cycles were understood as journeys between the human world and a place above. The crane at Göbekli Tepe might have been a symbol of passage, of the soul's flight, of the connection between the gathered community and the forces they could not see but felt in the flickering light of their fires. The aurochs, the massive wild cattle that once roamed these hills, is carved with a dignity that borders on reverence. The aurochs is never attacked on the pillars. It is never shown being hunted or killed. It stands, a monument in itself, majestic and powerful. The builders may have seen the aurochs as a symbol of strength and fertility, the ultimate source of life that sustained them through its meat and hide. By placing it on the central pillars, they may have been honoring the very forces that allowed their culture to survive. The aurochs is the giver of life, the abundant beast that must be respected. The scorpion and the spider add another layer of meaning. They are small, venomous, and hidden. They appear in the shadows of the carvings, tucked into the edges of the panels, or crouched near the base of the pillars. They represent the dangers that lurk in the unnoticed corners, the hidden threats that remind every visitor that safety in the sacred space is never guaranteed. They are the guardians of the margins, the creatures that keep the unworthy from wandering too far. Taken together, this vocabulary of animals paints a picture of a belief system that was intricate and deliberate. It was not a simple hunting cult or a random collection of clan symbols. It was a structured cosmology, a map of the world as the builders understood it, divided into domains of danger, guidance, transition, life, and death. Each animal stood for a concept. Each concept was connected to the others. The fox gave vision, the boar blocked the path, the snake guarded the threshold. The crane carried the soul, the aurochs provided the strength, the scorpion reminded of the hidden costs. These meanings were not written down in any language we can read today. They were carved into stone where anyone who entered the circle could see them. Over centuries, as the gatherings repeated and the tradition deepened, every visitor would have learned to read these signs. They would have known that entering Enclosure B meant facing the fox, that entering a different circle meant confronting the boar or seeking the crane. The ritual journey was not spontaneous. It was choreographed by the symbolic landscape of the pillars, guiding each participant through a fixed sequence of spiritual experience. And that sequence reveals a depth of thought that should not have been possible at such an early date. The people who carved these animals were not just expressing basic fears or hopes. They were organizing a philosophy, a way of understanding the structure of existence itself. They were saying, through stone, that the world is ordered, that meaning exists beyond the immediate, that forces we cannot control still have names and faces. even if those faces are carved in the shape of a fox or a crane. This was a civilization of the mind before it was a civilization of the city. The enclosure itself, the ground upon which these animal symbols stood, had a purpose that went far beyond simple gathering. It was built to frame a relationship that would ultimately prove more powerful than any single symbol carved into a stone wall. Centuries after the last pillar was laid flat and the hill was sealed with earth, a different kind of carving began to appear on clay tablets far to the south in the river valleys of Mesopotamia. There, the bull was not just a source of meat and hide. It was the sacred companion of the sky god Anu, its horns reaching upward like the crescent moon. The lion did not simply roam the grasslands. It was the roaring voice of the goddess Ishtar, a symbol of power and divine protection. The eagle did not merely circle the mountain peaks. It was the messenger of the storm god, soaring between the realm of mortals and the heavens. These powerful figures, the bull, the lion, the eagle, became the core symbols of the earliest known civilizations that grew along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers thousands of years after the builders of Göbekli Tepe had vanished. Yet when you look at the animal carvings on those ancient T-shaped pillars, you cannot help but notice a strange resonance. The aurochs, the wild ancestor of the bull, stands carved in stone at Göbekli Tepe with the same reverent posture it would hold in later temple art. The snake, which later appears in Mesopotamian myths as a guardian of sacred thresholds and a creature of hidden knowledge, coils across the surfaces of pillars at the oldest site. The bird of prey, though depicted as a vulture rather than an eagle, fills a role that feels strikingly familiar, a creature of the boundary between life and death, a carrier of the soul from one world to another. The symbols may have changed in name and detail over the millennia, but the underlying pattern remains. The menagerie of Göbekli Tepe seems to represent a shared symbolic language, a toolkit of sacred images that later peoples in the Fertile Crescent would adapt, reshape, and embed into their own mythologies. The bull, the lion, the eagle, and the snake would become the recognizable faces of Mesopotamian religion, carved into temple walls and cylinder seals for 3,000 years. But where did those symbols first come from? The conventional story has always assumed that they developed within the earliest cities as part of the complex social and political systems that emerged with urban life. That assumption now looks thin. At Göbekli Tepe, we find those symbols already fully formed, carved into stone more than 5,000 years before the first ziggurat rose above the plains of Sumer. The vulture on the pillar is not a crude sketch. It is a composed and confident piece of symbolism, showing a beak spread in flight over a headless human form, a clear statement about death and transformation. The snake is not a casual line. It winds up the stone in careful repeating curves, suggesting a deliberate pattern. This was not a trial run. This was a mature symbolic tradition. And that tradition may have been carried not by marching armies or migrating conquerors, but by stories passed down over campfires and around new hearths, as the descendants of the hunter-gatherers slowly adopted agriculture, built villages, and eventually filled the river valleys with cities. The mythology of the bull as a divine force did not have to be invented by the people of Uruk or It may have arrived with them, carried in their memories from a time when their ancestors gathered on a windy hilltop and stood before a stone bull carved into a 20-ton pillar. The place of the eagle in later epics may echo the same awe that ancient visitors felt when they saw the carvings of wings spreading across the limestone. This does not mean that the scribes of Babylon consciously copied Göbekli Tepe, but it does suggest that the site sits at the headwaters of a stream of symbolism that runs through the entire ancient Near East. The T-shaped pillars themselves may even find a distant echo in later architecture. In Mesopotamian temples, there was a tradition of placing two large pillars or gateposts at the entrance to the inner sanctuary, representing the boundary between the mundane and the sacred. The central twin pillars at Göbekli Tepe, standing in the heart of each enclosure, may have established that architectural language thousands of years before it was formalized in the first temples of the plains. The ancestors who built the hilltop sanctuary were not writing texts that we can read, but they were composing in stone a grammar of the sacred that would echo down through the ages, growing, evolving, and eventually finding its way into the great myths that would shape the religions of the ancient world. The dirt hauled out of Göbekli Tepe contained far more than stone chips and broken flint blades. It also held the remains of meals, massive grinding stones, each one weighing dozens of pounds and worn smooth by years of use, were found scattered among the enclosures. These were not small hand tools meant for grinding a handful of grain for a single family. They were heavy industrial mortars, basins carved from solid rock, deep enough and wide enough to process large quantities of wild einkorn and other plants at one time. Beside them lay the bones, piled in layers so thick that in some places they formed a compacted layer of white and brown, the accumulated remains of countless meals. The bones belonged overwhelmingly to gazelle, the swift-herd animals that once migrated through the valleys in enormous numbers. But there were also bones of wild cattle and smaller game, all showing signs of butchery and roasting. The picture these remains paint is vivid. During the seasonal gatherings, large groups of people came together on this hilltop, lit fires, and prepared food on a scale far beyond what a single band of hunter-gatherers would need for daily subsistence. They were feasting. The grinding stones were used to crush wild grain into coarse flour, which could be mixed with water and cooked into flatbread on heated stones. The basins held the crushed meat and marrow from the gazelle hunts. The smell of roasting wild game and baking bread would have filled the air, mixing with the smoke from torches that flickered against the limestone pillars. For the people who gathered there, this was not simply about eating. It was an event. Feasting served a purpose deeper than nutrition, a purpose written into the very design of the site. To understand why, you have to consider the challenge of organizing the construction of Göbekli Tepe. Quarrying, moving, and erecting the 20-ton pillars required hundreds of people working together under coordinated direction. That workforce had to come from somewhere. It could not be drawn from a single small band of maybe 30 or 40 individuals. It had to be pulled together from multiple groups spread across a wide region. But those groups were not naturally inclined to cooperate on such a scale. Hunter-gatherers generally maintain their autonomy, moving independently through the landscape, settling disputes through avoidance rather than negotiation, and keeping their social circles small and intimate. The feast changed that calculus. When the gazelle migrations reached their peak, when the wild grain was ripe for harvesting, the signals went out across the land. People began to converge on the hilltop, carrying their contributions of food, their stories, and their labor. Once there, they shared a massive meal. The preparation and consumption of that food created an atmosphere of abundance, generosity, and reciprocity. You share a meal with someone, and you owe them something. You are connected. The simple act of eating together, especially when the food is rich and plentiful, builds bonds that go beyond words. It creates a sense of obligation and trust that makes large-scale cooperation possible. In the context of Göbekli Tepe, the feast was the glue that held the entire enterprise together. When a group arrived at the hilltop and contributed their labor to dragging a 20-ton stone across half a mile of rugged ground, they were not paid with wages. There were no coins, no stored goods, no formal system of exchange. Instead, they were fed, they were honored, they were brought into the circle of feasters and given a place in the shared story of the gathering. The grinding stones and the animal bones are the material evidence of that system in action. The food brought people in, and the ritual framed the work as sacred. To feast at the foot of a newly raised pillar was to participate in something larger than a construction project. It was to affirm your membership in a community that spanned generations. The knowledge needed to organize these feasts, to know exactly when the wild grain would ripen and the gazelle would pass through, to understand the proper rituals for offering food before the central monoliths, was passed down from one generation to the next. Elders taught the young how to find the best stands of einkorn, how to stalk the migrating herds, how to operate the grinding stones efficiently. This transmission of practical knowledge happened alongside the transmission of ritual knowledge, the stories attached to the carvings, the proper way to enter an enclosure, the order of ceremonies. The feast was the classroom and the theater. Around the fire, between courses of roasted gazelle and flatbread, the history and meaning of the place were spoken aloud. Children learned what the fox and the snake stood for. Young adults learned the skills that would allow them to take their place in the annual gathering. And elders watched their traditions take root in the next generation, confident that the labor and sacrifice of their ancestors would not be forgotten. The evidence of feasting scattered across the site is a testament to that cycle. It shows that Gobekli Tepe was not just a place of silent meditation. It was loud, it was busy, it was filled with the clatter of grinding stones, the sizzle of meat over fire, the murmur of conversations, the laughter of reunion. People arrived exhausted from a long journey and left full and connected, bound together by shared labor and shared sustenance. That connection, renewed year after year, forged the bonds that made the monumental architecture possible. The stone circles were the spine of the site, but the feast was the heart that kept it beating. And as the years turned into decades and the decades into centuries, that pulsing rhythm of gathering, feasting, and building left its mark not only on the landscape, but on the social evolution of the people themselves. The next question becomes unavoidable. What happened to those traditions when the climate shifted and the feasts could no longer be sustained? Just under 50 miles to the northeast, on another hilltop overlooking the upper Tigris Basin, a second set of excavations told a story that could not be dismissed as coincidence. The site was called Nevali, and when archaeologists reached its deepest layers, they uncovered a ring of T-shaped limestone pillars that looked as if they had been carved by the same hands that worked the stone at Göbekli Tepe. The same stylized forms, the same humanoid proportions, the same careful positioning around a central pair of taller monoliths. It was as if the builders had carried a blueprint in their minds across the rugged landscape and planted it in the earth a second time. Nevali was smaller than its famous neighbor, but the similarities ran deep. The T-shaped pillars stood in a rectangular arrangement rather than a perfect circle, but the symbolic grammar was unmistakable. One of the central monoliths even carried a carving of a human head emerging from the top of the pillar, a face rendered with geometric features that brought the silent figure to life. Arms were wrapped across the chest in the same folded posture seen at Göbekli Tepe. Hands rested at the belly in that same gesture of stillness and witness. And around the base of the pillars, fragments of animal carvings echoed the same bestiary of snakes, birds, and wild beasts that guarded the older circles. The dating of Nevali placed it slightly later than the earliest layers of Göbekli Tepe, around 8000 BC. The same period when the great hilltop temple was beginning to fade. This alignment was a crucial piece of evidence. It meant that the cultural tradition behind the T-shaped pillars did not vanish when Göbekli Tepe was buried. It had already spread. Communities in the surrounding region had adopted the same architectural style, the same ritual symbolism, and presumably the same belief system that underlay the great temple. Nevali was not a copy made by imitators who had merely heard stories of a distant sacred site. It was a branch of the same living tradition, shaped by people who shared a common visual language and a common understanding of the spaces that language should inhabit. The implications are substantial. for a tradition to appear at two separate sites in the same region, overlapping in time, and with such consistency of form, the belief system behind it had to be widespread and enduring. The people who built Nevali quarry were not outsiders who had stumbled upon an old ruin and repurposed its stones. They were inheritors of a culture that had been thriving for centuries. They knew exactly what the T-shape meant, exactly how to shape a limestone block into a stylized body, and exactly what animal symbols belonged in the ritual space. That degree of shared knowledge across distance tells us something vital about the social networks of this era. The groups that gathered at Göbekli Tepe did not simply disperse and disappear. They maintained connections with each other, traveling across the landscape, exchanging ideas and techniques, and passing down the sacred architecture to the next generation. The tradition was strong enough to persist for centuries after the original hilltop temple was sealed away. When excavations at Nevali quarry also uncovered grinding stones, animal bones from feasting, and the remains of wild plants, the parallel became even more striking. The same seasonal pattern of gathering, feasting, and ritual construction that sustained Göbekli Tepe was alive and well at its younger counterpart. The tradition had not died. It had migrated, adapting to new settings while keeping its essential character intact. What Nevali quarry ultimately confirms is that Göbekli Tepe was never an isolated phenomenon. It was the wellspring of a wider cultural complex that stretched across southeastern Turkey and likely beyond, into valleys and mountains where the surface soil still hides secrets we have not yet touched. The hilltop was not a single stroke of brilliance by one extraordinary group. It was the expression of an entire civilization that understood its place in the world through the stone it carved and the circles it raised. That civilization did not need writing or kings to spread its influence. It only needed enough shared belief to keep the stones standing across hundreds of miles and 1,000 years. And Nevali quarry, buried under its own sediment and awaiting discovery, stands as proof that the people who built the first temple did not vanish into the past alone. They left fingerprints all over the ancient world, pressed into limestone, waiting for the archaeologists who would finally learn to read them. The ground at Karahan Tepe had barely been disturbed when the first T-shaped pillars emerged from the soil, and the shock rippled through the archaeological community. This site, located only about 30 miles east of Göbekli Tepe in the Tektek Mountains, was not a distant echo. It was another full-fledged ritual complex, complete with pillars set in circular enclosures, carved with the same stylized human forms and surrounded by the debris of ancient feasts. When the initial trenches revealed a central room carved directly into the living limestone bedrock, with pillars standing in 2 rows like a congregation waiting in silence, the implications became clear. Göbekli Tepe was not alone. Karahan Tepe was its sibling, built by the same culture, expressing the same beliefs, and occupying the same window of time over 11,000 years ago. The site was enormous, covering an area that rivaled or even surpassed the known extent of Göbekli Tepe. And as archaeologists continued to clear the rubble, they found carvings that deepened the mystery. A human head rendered in stone, life-sized, with eyes closed and lips slightly parted, lay near the entrance to one of the structures. It was an unmistakable portrait, the earliest known attempt at realistic sculpture of a face in the entire region. The features were not abstract or symbolic. They were specific. They belonged to someone. A snake coiled along the base of a nearby pillar, its body twisted in the same deliberate pattern seen hundreds of miles away. Foxes and scorpions reappeared, their postures matching the catalogue of animal motifs from the older site. Karahan Tepe was not a provincial copy. It was another center of the same ritual geography, a second node in a network that stretched across hundreds of square miles of the Turkish highlands. Researchers began to rethink the entire model. Instead of imagining a single isolated temple, they now faced a ritual landscape, a region dotted with sacred enclosures, each one built by people who shared a common symbolic language. These were not random settlements. They were gathering places arranged at intervals that could be reached on foot over several days of travel. The groups that visited one hilltop might have visited the other in different seasons, cycling through a calendar of ceremonies that bound the entire region together. The stone circles at Karahan echo the design of Göbekli Tepe in almost every essential feature. The T-shaped pillars, the central monoliths, the animal reliefs, the placement of benches for seated gatherings, all of it matches. But there are also differences that hint at local variation. The bedrock-cut rooms at Karahan Tepe are unique, chambers carved directly into the stone itself rather than built from separate blocks. The people of that location had developed their own architectural methods while keeping the core tradition intact. This blending of shared symbolism with local innovation points to a society that was not centrally controlled. There was no single capital, no king or priest issuing decrees from one hilltop. Instead, there was a cultural zone, a vast region where communities maintained independent lives but came together periodically at these ritual centers. They exchanged not goods alone but ideas. They taught each other how to carve the same animals, how to shape the same pillars, how to conduct the same ceremonies. The consistent imagery across all the sites is the clearest evidence of this shared worldview. At Karahan Tepe, a carved vulture spreads its wings over a scene of a headless human figure, the same arrangement that appears on the Vulture Stone at Göbekli Tepe. The same snake coils, the same aurochs stands, the same fox runs along the lower edge of the stone. The repetition is too precise to be coincidence. It is the signature of a living religion, a set of beliefs that span generations and miles. For the people who built these enclosures, the land itself was sacred. The hilltops were chosen not for their resources or defensibility, but for their visibility, their relationship to the horizon, their position in a spiritual landscape that modern eyes can only faintly perceive. Standing on the summit of Karahan Tepe, you can see the distant ridge that hides Göbekli Tepe on a clear day. The two sites were in visual contact. The builders knew exactly where the other circles lay. And between them, the ground is scattered with the remains of smaller enclosures, quarries, and work camps that have yet to be fully explored. The entire region was a construction zone of the sacred, worked over centuries by a population that understood itself as part of a larger whole. The scale of this undertaking forces a question that cannot be easily answered. If the society that built these sites was capable of coordinating across such distances, maintaining such consistency of belief and craftsmanship over so many centuries, why did they not leave behind any evidence of towns, fortified cities, or written records? The absence becomes the clue. Perhaps their power did not rest on control of territory or trade routes, but on a shared vision of the cosmos expressed in stone. Their cities were not of walls and markets. They were of pillars and enclosures visible from one mountain to the next, waiting for the seasons to bring the people back. Those distant stone circles rose from the earth during one of the most punishing chapters in recent geological history. The period known as the Younger Dryas had gripped the northern hemisphere for over 1,000 years, a sudden return to near glacial conditions that reversed the warming trend following the end of the last ice age. Temperatures dropped, rainfall patterns shifted. The lush grasslands that had supported vast herds of game began to shrink, replaced by cold, dry steppes. For the people living in the hill country of what is now southeastern Turkey, this was not an abstract climate event happening somewhere else. It was the ground beneath their feet turning harder. It was the familiar stands of wild grain producing thinner harvests. It was the herds of gazelle becoming less predictable, forcing hunters to travel farther and work harder for every meal. The world they had known was closing in around them, and yet, in the midst of this environmental stress, they chose to invest enormous labor not in digging better storage pits or building more efficient shelters, but in carving stone circles on a remote hilltop. This apparent contradiction is the key to understanding why Göbekli Tepe was built in the first place. When people face prolonged uncertainty, when the patterns of life that have sustained them for generations start to fray, they often turn to the one thing that offers a sense of control, the spiritual realm. Across human history, periods of drought, famine, and hardship have frequently given rise to intensified ritual activity, prayers for rain, ceremonies to restore the balance of the natural world, monuments designed to plead with forces believed to govern the cycle of life. The builders of Göbekli Tepe may have been acting on that same deep impulse. Their world was becoming less generous. The cold and the dryness were squeezing the margins of survival. And in response, they built a place where the community could gather, feast, and appeal to the powers they believed controlled their fate. The hilltop itself may have been chosen for its visibility, for its relationship to the sky, for the sense that it stood at the boundary between the struggling world of humans and the enduring world of the gods or ancestors. The enclosures were not just gathering spaces, they were instruments of persuasion. The carved animals, the foxes and the boars and the cranes, were not merely decorative. They were petitions made permanent. Each species that appeared on the pillars represented an aspect of the living world that the builders depended upon for survival. The swift gazelle, the strong aurochs, the watchful crane that marked the changing seasons. By fixing their images in stone, the people may have been attempting to fix the abundance of those creatures in the real world, to hold the forces of life steady against the winds of change. The ritual itself may have been an attempt to restore a world that felt like it was slipping away. Every stone hauled up that hill, every pillar carved and lifted into place, every feast shared within the circles was an act of hope. It was a declaration that despite the cold and the dryness and the dwindling herds, the community would endure. They would gather, they would build, they would call upon the powers they trusted to make the world fruitful again. And if you stand on that hilltop today with the wind cutting across the barren ridges, you can almost feel the weight of that hope pressed into the earth. The builders did not know why their climate was changing. They had no instruments to measure atmospheric shifts, no written records to compare one generation to the next. All they had was memory, tradition, and the growing unease that the old ways were becoming harder to sustain. In that uncertainty, they built a sanctuary, a stone anchor in a world that seemed to be drifting into trouble. It worked at least for a time. The site remained active for over 2,000 years, weathering the tail end of the Younger Dryas and the warming period that followed. The rituals must have felt effective. The gatherings must have brought comfort and a renewed sense of purpose, but the environmental pressure never fully lifted. It simply changed form, setting the stage for the great transformation that would eventually render the old way of life obsolete. The cold gave way to warmth. The grasslands returned, the herds grew plentiful again, but the people who had gathered on that hilltop for 2 millennia were not the same people who had built the first pillars. They carried within them a new set of expectations about what human society could accomplish when people worked together toward a shared goal. And when the climate finally stabilized, when the land grew warm and fertile enough to support something new, they took the lessons learned at Göbekli Tepe and carried them down from the highlands into the valleys below, where the first fields were about to be sown. As the climate warmed and the herds returned to the valleys, something began to shift deep in the rhythm of human life. The gatherings at Göbekli Tepe had required a level of coordination that no one had ever achieved before. People learned to communicate across distances, to plan labor over months and years, and to trust strangers who carried the same animal totems on their skin or in their stories. They learned to store wild grain not just for a single season, but to support a workforce that would return to the same hilltop generation after generation. These were skills that did not vanish when the feasts ended and the crowds dispersed. They were carried home, passed down, and refined. And when the landscape finally offered a new opportunity, those same skills were ready to be turned toward something that would change the world forever. The first farmers did not wake up one morning and decide to plant a seed. They had been managing wild grain for centuries at Göbekli Tepe, watching it grow, learning its habits, selecting the plants that held their seeds the longest. The very act of harvesting wild einkorn on such a massive scale had already begun to shape the evolution of the grain. The plants that held their seeds tightest were the ones that got collected and processed. Their seeds were the ones that sprouted the next season near the human gathering sites. Over countless cycles, the wild wheat became a little less wild. It became a little more dependent on the hands that had tended it. The temple did not just precede the farm, it may have created the conditions for the farm. Think of the shift that happened inside the enclosures. To build the stone circles, people had to organize themselves into teams, assign roles, manage schedules, and share resources. They had to negotiate disputes and keep the peace. They had to teach young members the skills of quarrying and carving, and the meanings of the symbols that gave the site its power. All of these were the building blocks of settled life. A village is just a gathering that never ends. The social architecture of Göbekli Tepe was a template for the settled communities that would follow. When the first permanent houses appeared in the valleys below, they were not the work of people who had never organized before. They were the work of people who had already spent 2,000 years learning how to come together, how to share, and how to commit to a place that mattered. The domesticated wheat that appeared in those early villages was not a sudden invention. It was the culmination of a long relationship between humans and a grain they had been nurturing for centuries without realizing they were farming. The sheep and goats that were first penned in the settlements did not come from nowhere. They were the descendants of wild herds that had been selectively culled, corralled, and protected during the seasonal gatherings at the temple. Göbekli Tepe flips the standard narrative on its head. The textbooks had always said that farming created civilization, but the evidence under that dusty hill suggests the opposite might be closer to the truth. Civilization, in the form of complex social organization, shared ritual, and coordinated labor, may have created farming. The people who domesticated the first crops were not primitive wanderers who stumbled upon agriculture by accident. They were the inheritors of a sophisticated tradition that had already mastered the art of large-scale cooperation. They knew how to plan, how to save, how to work together toward a goal that would not be completed in their own lifetime. Those skills were perfectly suited to the slow, patient work of turning wild plants into reliable crops. The hilltop temple was the classroom, the feasts were the tuition. The thousands of hours spent hauling stone and carving pillars taught a generation how to organize itself for a task that would take years. When they finally walked down from the heights and settled into the valleys, they carried that knowledge with them. They applied the same discipline to the fields, and the world changed forever. The Neolithic revolution was not a spark that ignited from nowhere. It was a slow fire that had been burning for 2,000 years inside the stone circles of Göbekli Tepe, waiting for the right moment to spread across the land. The people who built the first temple did not know they were setting the stage for everything that would follow. They were simply trying to hold their world together in a time of hardship and uncertainty. But by doing so, they created the social tools that would eventually allow their descendants to settle down, build villages, and turn the wild landscape into the foundation of civilization itself. There is another layer to this mystery, one that does not fit neatly into the slow drift of climate change and social evolution. Some researchers have proposed that the burial of Göbekli Tepe was not a gradual decision made over generations, but a sudden and desperate response to something far more immediate and terrifying. The evidence lies not in the stone circles themselves, but in a layer of ash and disrupted sediment found at sites across the entire northern hemisphere. all dated to a narrow window around 10,800 years before the present era. At that moment, something in the sky changed. The ice cores drilled from the Greenland ice sheet contain a thin layer of platinum and microscopic diamonds, markers that geologists associate with the impact of a fragmented comet or asteroid. The same signature has been found at over 30 sites spread across Europe, North America, and the Middle East, all pointing toward a cosmic event that would have been visible and devastating. If a comet or its debris entered the atmosphere over the region near Göbekli Tepe, it would have delivered a shockwave that flattened forests, ignited fires, and turned the sky a terrible red for days or weeks. The animals would have fled or perished. The rivers may have run thick with ash. The very ground beneath the hilltop would have trembled with a force that no human had ever experienced. In this interpretation, the builders of the great enclosures did not choose to abandon their sacred site. They were driven from it by a catastrophe that shattered the world they knew. The burial of the site, rather than being a slow and deliberate act of closure, may have been an attempt to restore order in the aftermath of chaos. Survivors returned to find the pillars standing but the land barren, the herds gone, the sky filled with strange dust. They could not make offerings to restore balance. They could only cover the monuments, tuck them into the earth, and hope that the powers that had broken their world would eventually grow calm again. The ash layer found in the soil at sites across Turkey, Iran, and Iraq does not settle the debate. The date of the proposed cosmic impact overlaps with the known period of Göbekli Tepe's burial, but the margin of error in both measurements is too wide to prove a direct connection. It remains a tantalizing possibility, a wild card in an already complex puzzle. What makes the theory compelling is not the certainty of the evidence but the texture it adds to the story. The people who built the stone circles faced a natural world that was powerful, unpredictable, and capable of ending their traditions in a single season. If a comet did streak across the sky above that hilltop, it would have been the kind of event that gets woven into myth, remembered for thousands of years as a time when the sky fell and the ancestors hid the sacred objects beneath the earth. No definitive mark of the impact has yet been found at the site itself, no melted rock, no telltale layer of shocked quartz in the soil of the enclosures. The theory remains just beyond the reach of proof, hovering at the edges of the mystery, keeping the door open to a version of events that is both simpler and more terrifying than the slow decline narrative. It asks us to imagine a generation that witnessed the end of their world not through gradual change, but through a flash and a roar that left them with nothing to do but bury what they loved and walk away. Whatever the true cause, the site was sealed and the tradition that built it slowly faded into the landscape. The silence that followed lasted for 10,000 years until the first shovel broke the soil again in the 1990s. And what that shovel uncovered was not just a temple or a monument. It was a warning, a message in stone that the dawn of civilization did not arrive quietly, but was forged in hardship, ceremony, and the resilience of people who refused to let their world disappear without leaving a mark behind. There is something strangely absent from the landscape of Göbekli Tepe, a silence in the soil that speaks as loudly as the carved pillars themselves. Despite over 2 decades of excavation across the sprawling hilltop, archaeologists have not found a single human burial within the enclosures. They have not uncovered the foundation of a single house, the remains of a hearth for everyday cooking, or the storage pits that would hold surplus grain through a winter. The ground surrounding the stone circles has been sifted and screened with painstaking care, yet it yields no evidence of domestic life, no sleeping quarters, no permanent shelter, no traces of children playing or elders resting by a fire. The people who built and used this site came here for one purpose, and when that purpose was fulfilled, they left. They did not live at Göbekli Tepe. They visited it, and the absence of their homes and their graves leaves a void that forces us to rethink everything about how they structured their lives. Imagine what it means for a place to be used for over 2,000 years, to host gatherings that brought hundreds, perhaps thousands of people to a single hilltop, and yet to contain no bedrooms, no kitchens, no cemeteries. The builders did not treat this site as a village that would grow over time. They preserved it as a sacred space, pure and separate from the mess of daily existence. The cooking fires that fed the workers were set up outside the enclosures, their remains scattered across the surrounding slopes rather than concentrated inside the circles. The tools used to carve the pillars were worked on the spot and then discarded into the backfill, not taken home to be stored for later use. The very ground beneath the stone circles was kept clean of domestic debris, as if the act of eating a simple meal within the enclosure would somehow diminish the power of the space. This careful separation between the sacred and the ordinary tells us something profound about the minds of the builders. They had a clear concept of what belonged inside the circles and what belonged outside. The rituals performed at the foot of the T-shaped pillars demanded a different kind of order than the one that governed daily life. The world of hunting, gathering, sleeping, and eating was kept at a deliberate distance, not because it was unimportant, but because its presence would have diluted the concentrated power of the gathering place. When the feast was over and the ceremonies complete, the people walked away. They did not pitch tents for the night within sight of the central monoliths. They withdrew to campsites on the lower slopes or in the nearby valleys where they lit their own fires, told their own stories, and prepared for the journey home. The hilltop itself remained empty, waiting for the next season, the next gathering, the next chapter of a tradition that would span 2 millennia. And if they did not live at the temple, and if they did not bury their dead in its shadow, then the living landscape of their daily existence lies scattered across the surrounding countryside, waiting to be discovered. The questions pile up faster than the answers. Where did these people sleep during the weeks they spent hauling stone? How did they organize the logistics of feeding a workforce that did not reside on the hill? Where did they bury the elders who passed away during the long years of construction? The absence of burials and domestic structures is not a flaw in the evidence. It is the most crucial clue of all, for it tells us that the first monumental architecture in human history was not an extension of home, but a flight from it, a leap into a space that was deliberately set apart from the rhythms of survival. That space held nothing of the mundane. It held only the sacred, and that single fact, more than any artifact or carving, is what makes Göbekli Tepe feel not like a step toward civilization, but like a window into a way of being that was lost as soon as the first permanent settlement took root in the valleys below. The builders' world was mobile. Their center was not a hearth or a house, it was the stone circle on the hill, a place they kept separate from the ordinary passage of their lives, a place they returned to again and again until the day came when they chose to seal it away forever. Somewhere among the hundreds of people who gathered on that hilltop, there had to be individuals who held a different kind of authority. The work of quarrying, moving, and carving multi-ton pillars did not organize itself. Someone had to decide where each stone would stand, what animals would be carved into its surface, and in what order the enclosures would be built. The sheer consistency of the symbolism across the site, the same animals appearing in the same postures for over 2,000 years, points directly to a class of people who preserved and controlled that knowledge. These were the ritual specialists, the shamans or elders who carried the stories of the ancestors in their minds and translated them into stone. In many complex hunter-gatherer societies studied by anthropologists, such figures hold a unique position. They are not chiefs in the sense of political rulers who command armies or collect taxes. Their power is different. It comes from their access to the invisible world, their ability to interpret dreams, read the movements of animals, and communicate with forces that ordinary people cannot see. Among the indigenous groups of the Pacific Northwest, the shamans were the ones who knew the proper songs and dances to ensure a successful salmon run. In the Arctic, the Angakok or shaman could travel to the spirit world to ask for favorable weather or abundant game. Their authority rested not on wealth or force, but on the belief that they held the keys to survival in an unpredictable world. The builders of Göbekli Tepe almost certainly had similar figures at the center of their society. The careful placement of animal carvings on the pillars, the repetition of specific creatures across different enclosures, the positioning of the most elaborate imagery at eye level for someone standing inside the circle, all of this suggests that a ritual specialist was directing the work. This person or group of people knew exactly which symbols belonged where and what sequence of images a visitor should encounter when moving through the enclosure. They were curators of a sacred geography that only they fully understood. The feasts that accompanied the gatherings would have reinforced their status. When the gazelle was roasted and the wild grain was ground into flour, the ritual specialist likely presided over the distribution of food, deciding who ate first and who received the choicest portions. In many ethnographic examples, the shaman or ceremonial leader sits at the head of the feast, serving as a conduit between the community and the forces that provided the meal. The act of giving thanks, of acknowledging that the abundance did not come from human effort alone, elevated the specialist above the ordinary hunter or gatherer. What makes this social structure so remarkable is that it existed among people who had no permanent settlements, no stored surplus, and no written records. The ritual specialists at Göbekli Tepe held their knowledge in memory and transmitted it orally from elder to apprentice over generations. The carvings on the pillars served as a visual aid, a permanent reminder of the stories that the specialist would recite during the ceremonies. When a young person stood before the carved fox for the first time, the shaman would tell them what the fox meant, what its presence in the enclosure signified, and what behavior it demanded from those who entered the circle. The stone was the textbook, and the ritual specialist was the teacher. This distribution of knowledge created a natural hierarchy. Those who knew the full meaning of the site held a power that the average visitor did not possess. They could decide who was initiated into the deeper mysteries and who remained on the periphery. They could interpret the will of the ancestors or the spirits that they believed inhabited the carved animals. Their word was not questioned because no one else had the authority to challenge it. In that sense, Göbekli Tepe may have been the birthplace of social stratification, not because one person conquered another, but because one person knew more than the rest. The same pattern appears in other monumental hunter-gatherer societies. The Chumash people of coastal California built impressive tomals or plank canoes and engaged in extensive trade networks, all without agriculture. Their society included a class of religious specialists known as the aurochs, who controlled the ceremonial knowledge and organized the major gatherings. Among the Jomon people of ancient Japan, who lived in settled villages but relied on hunting, fishing, and gathering for thousands of years, archaeologists have found evidence of ritual specialists associated with the construction of large stone circles and shell middens. In every case, the complexity of the social structure matched the complexity of the ceremonial architecture. At Göbekli Tepe, the role of the ritual specialist may have been even more critical because the site was not a village. There was no daily life to anchor the community between gatherings. The specialist had to maintain the knowledge across the long months when the hilltops stood empty, when the people had scattered across the landscape to follow the herds and gather the wild harvest. That knowledge had to be preserved without the support of permanent institutions, without a library or a school. It was carried in the minds of individuals who dedicated their lives to remembering and who passed that memory to the next keeper when their time came. The social role of these specialists helps explain why the site was eventually buried with such care. When the rituals ended and the gathering stopped, it was likely the last generation of specialists who made the decision to seal the enclosures. They could not leave the symbols exposed to the elements and to the ignorance of those who would come after and misunderstand what they meant. The burial was an act of preservation by the only people who fully understood the value of what was being hidden. They tucked the sacred knowledge into the earth, trusting that it would be safe until the time came for it to be uncovered again. And now that the stone has emerged from the soil, we are left with the symbols but without the specialists who knew how to read them. When you inspect the surface of a T-shaped pillar up close, a second layer of mystery reveals itself. The carvings were not simply scratched or pecked into the stone. They were sculpted with a precision that suggests the artists understood the optical properties of limestone, knowing exactly how light would fall across the surface in the flickering glow of a fire or the softer light of day. The reliefs, the foxes and snakes and cranes that emerged from the rock were not shallow scratches. They were cut deep into the stone, sometimes over half an inch, with edges that are still sharp and clean after 11,000 years. To achieve that level of detail with flint tools is a kind of mastery that professional stonemasons today would struggle to match with modern metal chisels. The primary tool used was a flint baron, a small sharp blade that can be gripped between the fingers. It works like a precise engraving tool, chipping away tiny flakes of limestone with each stroke. The builders did not have the luxury of sketching their designs on paper first. Every line in the stone was a permanent decision. There was no erasing, no redoing. A single slip with the baron would leave a mark that could not be removed without ruining the whole composition. And yet the carvings we see are clean, deliberate, and unhesitating. They show no signs of correction or hesitation. This means the carvers were not amateur experimenters. They were professionals who had spent years, perhaps entire careers, developing the feel for how the stone would respond to the pressure of the blade. They knew exactly where to cut to make the eye of a fox emerge from the rock, exactly how deep to go to create the impression of feathers on a crane's wing. After the rough carving was complete, the builders took an additional step that would not have been visible to anyone attending the rituals, but which demonstrates a level of care that goes far beyond simple function. Many of the pillars show signs of having been polished. The surfaces are smooth to the touch in a way that is inconsistent with rough tool marks. The builders likely used abrasive sand and water to grind down the high spots left by the carving process, achieving a finish that catches the light evenly and makes the figures stand out with remarkable clarity. This polishing step had no structural purpose. It was pure aesthetics, a commitment to quality that reveals the value the builders placed on the appearance of their sacred space. The technical challenge of working with limestone is that it is not a uniform material. Some layers are harder and denser, others are softer and crumbly, prone to flaking away if struck too aggressively. The carvers had to adapt their technique to the specific character of each block, reading the stone with their fingers and adjusting the angle of their blade moment by moment. This is not a skill that can be learned in a single season. It is the product of decades of apprenticeship, of learning from an elder who already knew the behavior of the local limestone. That apprenticeship structure hints at a society that valued specialized knowledge and invested the time required to pass it down. The human figures carved on some pillars show an additional layer of complexity. In the case of a pillar from Enclosure D, the arms are carved in high relief, actually projecting from the surface of the stone rather than being cut into it. Creating a raised relief is exponentially harder than incising a line. You have to cut away the background stone all around the arm, lowering the entire surrounding surface by a consistent depth while leaving the arm itself standing. One slip and the arm is gone. The fact that multiple pillars at the site bear this high-relief carving tells us that the builders were not simply competent. They were pushing the boundaries of what was possible with their tools. There is even evidence that some carvings were finished using a technique called pecking, where a harder stone is repeatedly struck against the surface to create a textured dot pattern. This technique is typically associated with much later cultures. At Göbekli Tepe, it appears in the details of the boar tusks and the eyes of the snakes, tiny additions that bring the animals to life. The combination of incised lines, high relief, and peck texture creates a visual richness that is almost impossible to capture in photographs. The stones have to be seen in person, in the changing light of day, to appreciate the depth that the carvers achieved. This sophistication in stoneworking does not exist in isolation. The same hands that carved the pillars also shaped the benches, the flooring, and the drainage channels that carried water away from the enclosures. Every element of the site shows the same attention to finish and proportion. The builders were not making do with crude approximations. They were executing a detailed architectural plan that included both structural and decorative elements. They understood how to balance the load of a roofing system over the central pillars. They knew how to cut stone sockets deep enough to anchor the monoliths securely for millennia. And they achieved all of this without metal, without wheels, without draft animals, and without a written language to record their designs. The level of skill on display at Göbekli Tepe forces a complete revision of what we thought early humans could do. For decades, the archaeological record had taught that fine stone carving emerged only in settled agricultural societies, where specialists could dedicate their full attention to craft without worrying about the next meal. The hilltop in southeastern Turkey tells a different story. The fine carving on those 20-ton monoliths was accomplished by people who still lived as mobile hunter-gatherers, people who walked to the site from distant valleys, performed their ritual work with flint tools that they carried in pouches on their belts, and then walked back home to follow the herds and gather the wild grain that sustained them. The gap between their tools and their output is so wide that it challenges the entire framework we use to measure cultural evolution. The carvings are not rough or primitive. They are refined, controlled, and deeply intentional. They announce that the builders were not just surviving their era, they were flourishing within it, pouring their most sophisticated knowledge into the stone circles that defined the center of their world. But there is another layer to the architecture that some researchers have been trying to peel back for years, a hidden dimension that may not have been carved or painted, but is nevertheless written into the very layout of the circles. Look at the way the enclosures are oriented relative to the horizon. The entrances to several of the oldest structures face in a specific direction, a direction that is consistent across the site. A small but persistent group of scholars has argued that this orientation is not arbitrary. They point to the rising of a particular star in the pre-dawn sky, a star known to many ancient cultures as Sirius, the brightest point of light in the heavens. According to this theory, the central pillars within some enclosures were positioned to align with the point on the horizon where Sirius would appear during a specific time of year, likely around the summer solstice. The idea is compelling because it links the physical space of the temple to the annual cycles of the sky, cycles that would have been deeply familiar to hunter-gatherers who depended on the rhythms of migrating herds and ripening plants. If the builders of Göbekli Tepe were indeed tracking the movements of Sirius, they would have been doing so roughly 4,000 years before the earliest known star maps were scratched into clay tablets in Mesopotamia. That is an extraordinary leap in timeline. The standard view of prehistoric astronomy is that consistent, deliberate celestial alignment belongs to the era of settled agricultural societies who built monuments like Stonehenge or the megalithic temples of Malta, all of which are thousands of years younger than Göbekli Tepe. To suggest that the same behavior existed at the very dawn of monumental architecture challenges not just the dating, but the entire model of how human knowledge of the sky evolved. Of course, not everyone agrees with the Sirius alignment theory. Many mainstream archaeologists caution that aligning a structure with a star is a difficult claim to prove without written records that confirm the intent. Stars drift slowly over millennia due to a wobble in the Earth's axis called precession, a process that gradually shifts the positions of all celestial bodies relative to the horizon. An alignment that works today would not have been correct 11,000 years ago. To test the theory, researchers must calculate backward using complex astronomical software, accounting for the slow precessional shift over hundreds of generations. These calculations are themselves open to interpretation. What one astronomer sees as a deliberate match, another may dismiss as coincidence, especially given the small number of surviving enclosures and the fact that many of them are still only partially excavated. The same debate applies to another alignment that has been proposed, this one connected to the solstices. The sun rises at its most extreme northern point on the summer solstice and at its most extreme southern point on the winter solstice. These are powerful, repeatable celestial events that almost every ancient culture marked in some way because they signal the turning of the seasons and the promise of returning light or abundant harvest. Some of the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe appear to have doorways or gap points in their surrounding stone walls that frame the rising or setting sun during these solstices. Again, the evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The ground is littered with debris and the circles are incomplete, making it difficult to determine the exact original orientation of every entrance. But the pattern is strong enough that it cannot be ignored. Think about what such alignments would mean if they turned out to be intentional. The builders of the enclosures would have been tracking not just the passage of time in days, but the cyclical return of key moments across the entire solar year. They would have known when the longest day arrived, and they positioned their most sacred architecture to frame that event as it touched the horizon. That knowledge would have given them a powerful tool. By controlling the calendar, they could predict when to gather for the seasonal rituals, when the herds would begin their migration, when the wild grains would be ready to harvest. A person or a group that possessed this astronomical understanding would have held a different kind of authority, a knowledge that felt like a direct channel to the forces that govern the movements of the herds and the ripening of the plants. The alignment theory does not require the builders to have had telescopes or precise mathematical formulas. It only requires them to have watched the sky with patient, sustained attention across many human lifetimes, noticing the slow drift of the sunrise point along the horizon as the seasons turned, and marking that movement with the permanent stones they had already learned to carve and raise. This is not an unreasonable proposition. Hunter-gatherers around the world, from the Aboriginal peoples of Australia to the Navajo of the American Southwest, developed sophisticated astronomical knowledge based on nothing more than generations of careful observation. They tracked the moon's phases, the rising of specific star clusters, and the shifting positions of the sun on the horizon, all without the tools we would consider necessary. The builders of Göbekli Tepe had the same night sky above them, the same compelling need to understand the rhythms that controlled their food supply, and a technology of stone that allowed them to fix their observations in a permanent form. The debate over astronomical alignments at the site may never be fully settled. The evidence is fragmentary, the calculations are open to interpretation, and the intentions of the builders are lost to time. But the very existence of the debate is itself a powerful statement. It means that the stones at Göbekli Tepe are not just old, they are complex enough to generate sophisticated arguments about what their builders knew about the cosmos. And that alone is a mystery that keeps drawing researchers back to the hilltop, night after night, watching the stars wheel overhead and wondering if the silent pillars already know the answer. A flowing artery of fresh water once curved through the landscape just a few miles from the standing stones. The Balik River, a modest but perennial tributary of the Great Euphrates, carved a green corridor through the dry highlands. For the people who gathered at Göbekli Tepe, that river was not just a source of drinking water, it was a highway, The same shallow waters that sustained the migrating herds and nourished the wild stands of einkorn wheat also offered a path for moving the heaviest burdens. Imagine the immense weight of a 20-ton pillar quarried from the limestone ridge and dragged to the riverbank. Once there, the stone could be lashed to a raft or floated on a simple wooden platform, guided by teams of workers walking along the shore. The river did the hardest work, carrying the weight that hundreds of human shoulders could barely budge across dry land. The proximity of the site to this navigable waterway may have been the single most important factor in its location. A hilltop temple that could only be reached by foot would have demanded an unsustainable investment of labor, requiring every block to be dragged over rough terrain for miles. But a hilltop with a river at its base opened a different possibility. The stone could be moved in stages, first by sledge from the quarry to the water's edge, then by raft to a point near the temple, then by sledge again up the final slope. That division of labor, splitting the transport into dry and wet phases, made the impossible seem merely difficult. The river also solved the problem of scale. To move a single monolith entirely by land from the quarry to the enclosures, you need a workforce that can eat and drink and rest over the course of a multi-week journey. The workers themselves need to be supplied, and that supply chain adds its own weight to the operation. But with the river in play, you can stage the transport over a much shorter land leg. The heaviest work, the lifting and sliding, happens only at the quarry and at the final ascent. The middle stretch is handled by the current that allowed the builders to gather a larger workforce than they could have supported with purely land-based logistics, and it also freed up time for other tasks like carving the pillars or preparing the stone sockets. Water in this landscape was not simply life-giving. It was a technological force that the builders had learned to harness. They understood that a stone placed on a raft weighed no more than the raft itself in the eyes of the river. They understood that the current moved at a predictable speed and could be navigated by someone who knew its bends and shallows. And they understood that the river connected their hilltop to a much wider world, because the Balik did not end at the temple's slope. It flowed on to join the Euphrates, and the Euphrates connected to the entire Fertile Crescent. This was no accident. The network of rivers that crisscrossed the region meant that goods, people, and ideas could travel along the waterways with far less effort than across the dry hills. Groups who came to Göbekli Tepe from distant valleys likely used these same rivers as their highways, navigating by the current and camping on the gravel bars at night. When the season of gathering ended, they climbed back onto their rafts or walked along the riverbanks to return home, carrying with them the memories of the ceremonies and the skills they had learned from other groups. The river was the thread that held the whole system together. It turned a remote hilltop into a hub, a place that could be reached by multiple communities who shared the same waterway. Without the Balik, the gatherings might never have achieved the scale they did. Without the river, the massive pillars might never have left the quarry. The builders lived in a world where water was not just something to drink. It was a tool, a road, and a link between scattered peoples. And the same current that carried their stones also carried their stories, passing them downstream to the generations that would eventually inherit the valleys below. The river did not stop flowing when the last pillar was buried. It kept cutting its channel through the landscape, slowly erasing the traces of the paths that had once connected the quarries to the riverbank. But the memory of that connection remains written in the geography of the land itself, waiting for someone who knows how to read it. The marks of decline are subtle at first, barely visible to anyone who does not spend years studying the stones. But once you learn to read them, the evidence becomes unmistakable. As the excavation teams moved upward through the stratigraphy of Göbekli Tepe, they encountered a clear pattern of diminishing ambition. The earliest enclosures, the ones that stunned the world with their massive pillars and intricate carvings, belonged to the deepest layers. The ones above them, built by later generations, were smaller. The T-shaped pillars grew shorter and less carefully shaped. The animal reliefs became simpler, more repetitive, less inspired. The stone benches that lined the inner walls grew narrower. The circles themselves lost their perfect geometry, becoming roughly oval or irregular, as if the builders no longer had the time or the expertise to achieve the precision of their ancestors. The later generations were still participating in the tradition, still coming to the hilltop to build, but their hearts did not seem to be in it the same way. Something essential had been lost. This decline is visible not just in the architecture, but in the debris left behind by the workers. The later layers contain more broken tools, more signs of hurried or careless work. The carvings show less variety, with the same simple animal forms repeated across multiple pillars, as if the symbolic language that had once been so rich and specific was fading from memory. The spirit of innovation, the drive to create something new and powerful, had given way to a kind of routine maintenance, a going through the motions. For a site that had stood as the center of a vast ritual network for nearly 2,000 years, this decline must have been slow and painful, a gradual loosening of the bonds that had held the community together. The reasons for this fading of purpose are almost certainly woven into the broader changes sweeping across the landscape. Around the time the later enclosures were being built, the first signs of settled agriculture were appearing in the valleys below. People were beginning to plant the very grains they had once gathered wild. They were building permanent homes clustering together in small villages. The social world was shifting, drawing people into a new kind of relationship with the land, one that tethered them to a single place rather than calling them to roam in seasonal rhythms. A community that is anchored to its fields does not need to travel miles to a distant hilltop for a ceremony. The fields themselves become the center of ritual life, the source of sustenance and meaning. As agriculture took hold, the great gatherings at Göbekli Tepe may have started to feel less essential, more like a relic of an older way of life that no longer fit. At the same time, the environment was sending its own signals. The climate had warmed after the end of the Younger Dryas, but the warmth was not stable. Periods of drought punctuated the centuries, stressing the wild resources that the gatherings depended on. If the herd stopped migrating through the region in the same numbers, if the wild grain patches became less reliable, then the logistics of supporting a large temporary workforce became harder and harder to justify. It is difficult to convince people to travel a long distance for a feast when there is no guarantee that the feast will be abundant. The calendar that had once pulsed with predictable abundance was losing its rhythm. And perhaps deeper than climate or economy, there was a simple shift in belief. After 2,000 years of standing before the same animal carvings and performing the same ceremonies, the stories may have started to lose their power. The young may have grown less interested in the traditions of their elders. New symbols, shaped by the new experience of living in settled villages, may have begun to resonate more strongly than the old stone foxes and vultures. A religion that had united scattered hunter-gatherers for countless generations may have felt irrelevant to a people who now defined their lives by the boundaries of a field and the walls of a house. No one decided to end the tradition with a single dramatic act. Instead, the gathering grew smaller year by year. The enclosures were left half-finished. The grinding stones stopped turning. The fires that had flickered around the pillars for 2,000 years finally went cold. And then, at some point, the last handful of visitors to the hilltop, the last keepers of a dying practice, made the decision that preserved the site for the ages. They did not abandon it to the weather and the scavengers. They buried it. But even that burial, as monumental as it was, could not hide the fading inscriptions of the stones themselves, markings that told a story far older than farming. In that final act of backfilling, the last generation delivered the hilltop into a silence that lasted over 10,000 years. They were the ones who closed the chapter, ending one of the longest continuous ritual traditions in human history. And as they walked down the slope for the last time, the world behind them was already moving toward villages, towns, and ultimately the first cities, each built on a foundation that no one even remembered anymore. But when we run water across some of those buried stones today, a pattern emerges that no human eye saw for 80 centuries. There is a ghost in the carving that is visible only under a trickle of wet limestone, and it will lead us to a forgotten creature lost beneath the heat shimmer of the growing fields and grazing animals. Only about 5% of the entire hill has ever felt the touch of an archaeologist's trowel. The remaining 95% still lies buried beneath layers of sediment, broken stone, and the slow accumulation of 10,000 years. That single fact transforms the entire understanding of the site. What has been uncovered so far, the massive circles, the intricate carvings, the evidence of feasting, is merely the tip of a much larger mystery waiting beneath the surface. Every new trench that is opened reveals something unexpected, a previously unknown enclosure, a different configuration of pillars, a fresh cluster of animal carvings that no one predicted. The hill keeps giving, and it seems to have no intention of revealing all its secrets at once. The pace of discovery is deliberately slow and careful. Each excavation season advances the work by only a few meters, meticulously peeling back the layers of soil and recording every fragment of bone and every chip of flint. The team of archaeologists and local workers treats the ground like a delicate manuscript, reading it line by line, page by page. The work is painstaking because the rewards are so immense. One misplaced stroke of the trowel could destroy evidence that would take a generation to interpret. So the progress is measured in centimeters, not feet, and the full excavation of the site will likely take not decades but centuries. In the meantime, a powerful new technology has entered the story. Ground-penetrating radar has been deployed across the hillside, sending electromagnetic pulses into the earth and reading the echoes that bounce back from buried structures. What those radar images reveal is staggering. The entire hilltop is honeycombed with anomalies, dense signatures that strongly suggest the presence of additional stone circles, perhaps as many as 20 or more, still fully intact beneath the undisturbed soil. Some of these signatures match the pattern of the enclosures already excavated. Others appear to be different, perhaps representing a style of construction that no living archaeologist has ever seen. The radar tells us that what we know of Göbekli Tepe today is just a fragment of a much larger complex, a vast ritual landscape that was planned and built on a scale we are only beginning to comprehend. There is talk among the research team of a second hill, a nearby rise that has barely been examined but whose surface is littered with the same flint tools and broken limestone fragments that first alerted Klaus Schmidt to the presence of the main site. Some researchers suspect that this second hill may conceal a sister complex, a counterpart to the known enclosures that would double the known extent of the sacred landscape. The funding to test this hypothesis is slowly being gathered, and each new season brings the possibility of a breakthrough that could reshape everything once again. Every year when the excavation season opens, a small group of specialists returns to the hilltop. They set up their tents, lay out their tools, and begin the slow work of peeling back another thin layer of soil from the unexcavated sections. The local community watches with a mixture of pride and curiosity. The discoveries have brought attention, tourism, and a sense of connection to a past so deep that it defies the imagination. Children who grew up hearing stories of the stone heads that farmers used to find in their fields now see their grandparents walking past the very pillars that their ancestors may have stood before 11,000 years ago. The work continues season after season because the site demands it. Every unanswered question, and there are so many of them, is a lure that pulls the researchers back. Why was the site arranged in the specific patterns we see? What ceremonies took place in the enclosures that we have not yet opened? Are there more human remains buried in the unexcavated areas, remains that might finally tell us who these people were and what they believed. The future of Göbekli Tepe promises not a single final answer, but a deepening of the mystery. With each new pillar that emerges from the soil, the story becomes richer, more layered, and less compatible with the simple timeline that once described the rise of human civilization. The site was built to outlast its builders, and it has done exactly that. As the radar sweeps and the trowels dig, the hilltop continues to reveal a narrative that reaches from a time before writing, before cities, and before farming, directly into the present moment, where a small team of people kneels on the earth, trying to understand what moved their ancestors to raise stone that still stands. Archaeology is a discipline built on patterns, on sequences of cause and effect that explain how human societies transformed over time. For over a century, one of the most reliable of those patterns was the belief that agriculture came first and that everything else followed. The textbook model was clear: you plant the seed, you harvest the surplus, you feed the specialists, you build the temple. It was a neat ladder with clear rungs, and every culture was expected to climb them in the same order. Then the dirt at Göbekli Tepe began to yield its secrets, and that ladder did not just wobble, it broke. The site presents a complete inversion of the assumed sequence. The temple came first. The monumental architecture, the intricate symbolism, the coordinated labor, all of it was achieved by people who had not yet learned to farm. The wild grains they gathered and the game they hunted were sufficient to support gatherings that could move 20-ton stones, but they were not yet domesticated. This single fact has forced archaeologists to confront a profound possibility: that the urge to build something sacred, to create a fixed point in a mobile world, may have been the very force that pushed human societies toward the settled life that eventually produced agriculture. People did not build Göbekli Tepe because they had a food surplus. They built it because they had a reason to gather, and the act of gathering created the conditions that made surplus necessary. The effort of hauling and carving the pillars demanded a workforce that could be fed for extended periods, and that demand incentivized the intensive management of wild resources that slowly edged toward domestication. The relationship between the sacred and the practical is therefore reversed. In the older model, religion was a kind of decoration applied to a society that had already figured out how to feed itself. At Göbekli Tepe, religion looks more like the engine that drove the entire process forward, the reason why people began to stay longer in one place, to manage the landscape more carefully, and to pass down the skills that would eventually become the foundation of village life. This shift in perspective is not minor. It touches the deepest assumptions about what makes civilization possible. For generations, scholars have treated organized religion as a product of settled societies, a way for elites to control populations and justify hierarchies. The hilltop in Turkey suggests that the opposite may be closer to the truth. The rituals performed in the stone circles were not tools of control invented by a ruling class. They were the shared experience that bound together disparate groups, creating the social trust that made large-scale cooperation possible in the first place. The belief system came before the power structure. The collective vision preceded the individual authority. That inversion has profound consequences for how we understand the entire arc of human prehistory. It means that the human capacity for abstract thought, for creating meaning beyond survival, was not a luxury that appeared after people had filled their bellies. It was a fundamental driver of change, as essential as the hunting skills that brought down the gazelle and the knowledge of plants that found the ripening grain. The stones on that hilltop declare that the need to make sense of the world, to mark its passages and honor its forces, was not a late addition to the human story. It was present from the very beginning of our attempt to build something permanent. The timeline of social complexity has also been shattered. Before Göbekli Tepe, the earliest complex societies were thought to have emerged in the river valleys of Mesopotamia around 4000 BC. That was the benchmark, the earliest date at which archaeologists could point to evidence of organized labor, craft specialization, and monumental construction. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe push that date back by more than 5,000 years, more than doubling the known span of human social complexity. The hunter-gatherers who built this place were not simple or primitive in any meaningful sense of those words. They were capable of planning, coordination, and sustained effort on a scale that earlier generations of scholars would have dismissed as impossible. The realization has forced a re-evaluation of every other hunter-gatherer site from the same period. Are there other hilltops hiding similar secrets? Are the stone circles we have already found merely the most visible expression of a widespread tradition that we have failed to recognize because we did not know to look for it? The paradigm shift is still unfolding, but its direction is clear. The story of civilization is not a single ladder with agriculture at the bottom. It is a web of interlocking changes with belief, cooperation, and the construction of sacred space playing roles that we are only beginning to appreciate. The very definition of what it means to be complex has been challenged. At Göbekli Tepe, complexity did not require writing or kings or stored grain. It required a shared vision compelling enough to move stone and strong enough to hold a community together for 2,000 years. That is a form of civilization we had no name for until the earth gave back what it had hidden. And now that it has been uncovered, the quiet assumption that religion is a product of settled life will never stand on solid ground again. The temples came before the fields. The sacred space shaped the society that filled it, not the other way around. The stones of Göbekli Tepe have rewritten the first chapter of our shared history, and every page that comes after must be read in their light. The weight of that revision settles onto the shoulders of every theory that once seemed settled, pressing down until something has to give. More than 20 years of excavation have peeled back the soil, revealing enclosures, carvings, and tools that have forced a total rewrite of prehistory. But for all that has been uncovered, the most striking truth about Göbekli Tepe is how much remains unknown. The site is not yielding its secrets easily. Each new discovery seems to generate more questions than answers, and those unanswered questions are what keep drawing researchers back to the hilltop season after season. The single most pressing mystery, and the one that hangs over every discussion of the site, is the exact purpose for which it was built: a temple, a meeting ground, an astronomical observatory, a center for ancestor worship. Each of these explanations has been proposed, and each has evidence to support it. But none of them fully explains why this particular hilltop, at this particular moment in history, became the focus of such immense effort. The word temple is used because it is the closest term we have, but it carries assumptions about organized priesthoods and formal liturgies that may not apply to a hunter-gatherer society. Perhaps the rituals performed in those stone circles were something for which we have no modern equivalent, a kind of gathering that blended worship with social negotiation, storytelling with the transmission of survival knowledge. The carvings on the pillars present a second and equally stubborn mystery. The animals are arranged with clear intentionality, the same creatures appearing in the same postures across multiple enclosures, but their meanings remain locked behind the silence of time. The fox might have represented a clan, or a spirit, or a warning, or an invitation. The vulture might have carried souls to the afterlife, or marked the territory of a particular ritual group, or simply represented the practical reality of death and decay in the landscape. Without a written language to decode the symbols, we are left to guess, and the guesses are often guided more by the assumptions of the modern interpreter than by any direct link to the minds of the builders. That gap between what we see and what we understand is perhaps the most profound challenge the site presents. We can describe the carvings in precise detail. We can map their distribution and compare them across enclosures, but we cannot hear the stories they were meant to tell, and we may never be able to. The fate of the builders themselves is another mystery that shadows every discussion. At the height of the site's activity, hundreds, perhaps thousands of people were gathering seasonally on this hilltop, working together on a scale that had never been attempted before. Where did those people go when the tradition ended? Did they scatter into the surrounding valleys, carrying their beliefs and their organizational skills with them, eventually blending into the first farming communities that were beginning to emerge? Or did something more abrupt intervene, a climatic downturn, a social collapse, a catastrophic event that broke the networks that held the gatherings together? The evidence is fragmentary. The layers of soil suggest a gradual decline, but they do not rule out a sudden end. The DNA of modern populations in the region might eventually offer clues about which lineages trace back to the builders, but the work of tracing those genetic threads is still in its early stages. The people themselves have left no names, no faces beyond the stylized figures on the pillars, and no written accounts of their lives. They remain a ghost population, visible only through the traces of their labor. The biggest question of all is whether Göbekli Tepe stands alone. Ground-penetrating radar has already revealed that the excavated structures represent only a fraction of what lies beneath the hill, with perhaps 20 more enclosures still buried. But the surveys do not stop at the boundary of the main site. A similar signature has been detected on a neighboring hill, and other anomalous readings have been noted across the broader landscape of southeastern Turkey. It is entirely possible that Göbekli Tepe is not an isolated monument but part of a dense network of ritual centers built by the same culture over centuries. If those other sites exist, and if they are preserved as well as the known enclosures, the implications are staggering. The picture of a few scattered hunter-gatherer bands would be replaced by an entire regional civilization, organized around shared beliefs expressed in permanent stone. The search for these hypothetical sister sites is one of the most urgent projects in modern archaeology, but it is a search that proceeds slowly, constrained by funding, permissions, and the sheer difficulty of locating buried structures that have been hidden for 10,000 years. Each new season brings the hope of a discovery that could transform the picture once again. The mystery of Göbekli Tepe is not diminishing with time. It is deepening. The more we learn, the more we realize how little we know, and that growing awareness is itself a kind of discovery. The site teaches humility. It reminds us that the past is not a simple story that we can summarize in a textbook. It is a layered, complex, and often baffling landscape that we are only beginning to explore. The tools we have to investigate that landscape, the trowels and the radar and the laboratory techniques, are powerful, but they are not magic. They cannot bring the voices of the builders back. They can only amplify the whispers that remain in the stone, and those whispers, faint as they are, hint at a world that was richer, stranger, and more capable than the one we imagined. The great hill continues to hold its secrets close, yielding them only slowly, and only to those patient enough to listen. For every answer that emerges from the soil, a dozen new questions rise to take its place, keeping the mystery alive and the work unfinished. Every stone circle on that wind-swept hill tells a single undeniable truth. The old story, the neat timeline where agriculture gave birth to civilization, is no longer complete. Göbekli Tepe has pushed back the dawn of complex society by thousands of years, revealing a world where hunter-gatherers carved 20-ton pillars, organized vast seasonal gatherings, and built the first known temple before anyone had planted a single seed or penned a single word. That is not just an archaeological footnote, it is a fundamental reshaping of how we understand the human journey. The people who raised those monoliths were not waiting for civilization to arrive. They were building it with their own hands, driven by a shared vision that we are only beginning to glimpse. What makes this site so humbling is not its age alone, but the depth of the mystery it preserves. For all the decades of excavation, for all the careful sifting of soil and analysis of bones and seeds, the full meaning of Göbekli Tepe remains just beyond our reach. We can describe the pillars in precise detail. We can map the patterns of the carvings and trace the movements of the animals across the stone. We can even reconstruct the feasts that brought hundreds of people to the hilltop year after year. But we cannot enter the minds of the builders. We cannot hear the stories that were spoken in those circles or understand the beliefs that animated every hammer stroke on every monolith. The site is a reminder that the past is not a completed puzzle waiting to be solved. It is a landscape of questions, and the deepest ones may never have answers. That sense of unfinished knowledge is not a failure of archaeology. It is the very thing that makes this discovery so powerful. Göbekli Tepe stands as a witness to how much we still do not know about our own origins, and it invites us to remain curious, humble, and open to the possibility that the story of human prehistory is far richer and stranger than any single theory can contain. If this exploration has shifted the way you see the deep past, if it has sparked a new curiosity about the people who built the first temple, then the stones have done their work. They have reached across 11,000 years and found a new audience. Subscribe to stay connected to the discoveries that continue to reshape our understanding of the ancient world. Share this video with someone who loves history and help keep the conversation about the dawn of human complexity alive. The mysteries beneath the hilltop are far from solved, and the next season of digging may reveal something that changes everything once again.